I'm Maggie. I'm a licensed clinical psychotherapist with degrees in psychology, theology, and marriage and family therapy, a national certification in dialectical behavioral therapy, and a national certification in integrative mental health. In this video, I'm not looking to diagnose anyone. I'm only willing to offer insight into situations like these.
Hello, friends. All right, so this may be the most important video that you will ever watch. Whether you're a skeptic about the stuff that I talk about, or you already see things that don't seem to connect, and so that's why we're connecting. After watching this, you really can't ever go back. This actually maybe get me kicked off of YouTube. I'm already shadow banned, so I guess I need to start watching my language and using couched terms, which is why on the thumbnail it says tiny hats. So I will try to be a little more careful with my language. Okay, so first I'm going to say hello to the first in. Auntie is here first. She says hi with the peace sign. That's my favorite Auntie. Kevin Thompson is here. He says, good day, Maggie and everyone. Hello, Kevin. Eternal Rhythm Flow is here. He said, this is my favorite song. And then he said, no, wait, this one is my favorite. Yeah, I like that last one the best. That last song was actually a gift for me. So that was very nice. So these folks are a part of the best live tribe on YouTube, bar none. So if you're watching from the clouds, please feel free to say hello. You will be welcomed as long as you're mostly appropriate. And also shout out to the replay gang. Hi, JB Designs. Thanks for being here. Eternal Rhythm Flow says Maggie is my favorite shadow banned podcaster. I appreciate that so very much. All right, so here we go. Adrian just made it in right before I did. He says, let's go. All right, so what if I told you that some tiny hats along with some like red hat wearing people, among select others, are parasites from outer space? I know it sounds crazy. I know. But wait to make your decision about what you think until you get all the information. So I'm going to start with some video clips here. So I'll be playing some clips as we go through all this stuff. I want to say, as we're going through, I'm going to be playing seemingly unrelated or peripherally unrelated, you know, tiny hats, video clips. But then once that is done, I'm going to bring it all together and you're going to be shocked. But, you know, if you have questions, you have questions. So let's...
the only mention of a star being flown in the Bible can be found in Acts 7:43, the star of Remphan. Acts 7:43 states, ye took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Remphan, figures which ye made to worship them, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. The star of Remphan, or their god Moloch, is a hexagram. Hex is another word for curse, and the state of Israel, created by the Rothschild family through war and deceit, is a curse on the entire world. The hexagram is not an ancient symbol of Judaism. The hexagram was adopted by the Zionist movement in the late 19th century. It comes from the Rothschild family, and it is a symbol of Zionism, not a symbol of Judaism. It is an abomination to fly that flag here in America. That star represents the number of the beast, as spoken about in the book of Revelation. That star is 666 encoded. It is 6 small triangles, 6 lines, and a 6-sided polygon with 6 60-degree angles. It is literally a symbol of 666, the number of the beast.
Okay, and we're going to go more into that, but the cube, the square, and the hexagram are going to become very important as we move along.
Single textbook we got as a kid came from a Masadi. By the way, McGraw-Hill, you know who started that? Ghislaine Maxwell's dad.
You gotta be fucking
Robert Maxwell owns, every single textbook we got as a kid came from a Mossad agent.
Oh my fucking God.
Yeah.
Not my Texas history book. not all 11 of them.
Okay, who is McGraw-Hill?
They made all the textbooks, right? You ever look at your textbook?
When you were a little kid, it was made by McGraw.
Oh, that's the publisher.
That's the publisher.
Oh my God.
That was apparently founded by Jeffrey Epstein's girlfriend's dad.
Yep. So that's a reminder. We've already talked about that. We've already established it on this channel. You know, we've talked a lot about everything that tiny hats run and rule. What they say they run and rule is not a conspiracy theory anymore because they say it out loud. You can go back and watch the video, You Can Say It, But I Can't, where they say all of it, okay? And again, we're keeping these things in mind. This is a bunch of clips that seem unrelated. But some of you will see the pattern. I know you will.
You've been kicked out for nearly every country you've been in for what you practice. At what point are you the problem? Literally sucking you know where. Love him or hate him, Farrakhan knew this and he was exposing the Jewish supremacy. Check it out.
Do they control education? Yeah. Do they control the American Medical Association? Yeah. Do they control the American Dental Association? Yeah. The psychologists? The psychiatrists? Come on, they do.
You can't say that. They don't actually believe that.
Jews will always control you everywhere you go in the world. Who is running all the financial? Always the Jews. The Jews are in charge of the world. Science, financial, politics, behind the president.
Okay, never mind, proceed.
Because they are the absolute master of their world. That's the boss. You know, the Jews, they don't fight. They let the Italians, the Irish, the Polish do their fight.
Come on now, they fight their own battles.
We Jews are God's chosen people, and the Gentiles must learn their purpose in life is to fight and die for Israel.
Oh.
Okay, so we're establishing a baseline here. And if you've watched my channel for a while, you'll also have some stuff in the back of your mind about the Shasu, the bloodlines, even the Freud book review that I did, because it's all coming to fruition now. But I want to go back in time to another point in history that I haven't talked about yet. Let me get this pulled up here. Okay. Have you guys heard of the Tengu? The Tengu. Okay. So Tengu are the bird-like demons that almost became divine. You see the picture here? For those of you who are listening and you can't see your screen, this is a red face, larger eyes, very thick and bushy eyebrows, very long pointed Pinocchio type nose, frowning, and it has a very small hat tied to its head that is in the shape of a hexagon. So, Tengu, the bird-like demons that almost became divine. Okay, so a familiar figure to visitors to Japanese shrines and temples, the long-nosed Tengu is a supernatural being that inhabits mountainous areas. Tengu have wings that allow them to fly like birds, as well as magical powers that they use for both good and evil ends. Belief about Tengu have undergone numerous changes over the centuries. So when you read this article, and please feel free to check me, right? You see that the Tengu start as demons. They are very much demons. They are greedy. They are self-centered. And the belief is that if a priest, a monk, leads, has some sins, is kind of greedy or jealous, then he will be reincarnated as a Tengu because they are greedy and selfish and self-centered. So as you go through and read about, I read several articles. This article is actually very nice, but here's another picture here of a Tengu. Skin's not quite red. Sometimes the Tengu have white skin. Sometimes it's red skin. This one's a little bit dark. Again, you see the hexagon hat worn on the top of the Tengu's head, but it has some bird-like features. In China, they had the same creature, but it's the dog, the celestial dog. So, and here's the Chinese trying to kill it. But they're very, very similar to what these creatures were, right? In China, they are the Tiangu, which I know I'm not pronouncing correctly. But it will even tell you as you find articles, as you look at articles, that it is a common belief, it is a mainstream belief that what this demon represents may have been the Japanese and Chinese first encounters with Europeans. Which Europeans, you might ask? Well, Hi, Vincent. Thanks for being here. And he says, people finally unplugging from the matrix and educating themselves, asking questions. Finally. Yeah, Auntie's been this way forever. Kevin says, they say that the fallen angels look like clowns. Yes, I have heard about that. And I am going to talk about the fallen angels. Like I said, hey, Leon, this show is connecting everything together. It is connecting everything together. Okay, I'm going to take this out. All right, now we're going to go back to this video.
The United States government has started releasing never-before-seen UFO files, and this time, it says the public can decide what to believe. The Pentagon, through the U.S. Department of Defense, has begun publishing a fresh set of documents related to UFOs, officially called Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena, or UAPs. In a post on X, the Pentagon said earlier administrations often tried to discredit or discourage public discussion around such sightings. But under Donald Trump, the focus is now on what it calls maximum transparency. According to the Pentagon, this is not just a single agency effort. It involves multiple U.S. government bodies, including the White House, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the Department of Energy, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or ARO, NASA, the FBI, and other intelligence agencies. All the release material is being hosted on a dedicated platform, war.gov/UFO. And the Pentagon says more files will be released in phases on a rolling basis.
Okay, so you guys know my theory on this. I've said it many, many, many times. Aliens, angels, demons, watchers, Anunnaki, the Nomo of the Dogon, Quetzalcoatl, Ra, Elohim, Yahweh, all of them, they are all the same things, beings from out there in the sky, right? They are all the same thing, but just different names for the exact same things. They're just from out there. And I'm sure it's true. And you may believe it in the end. But, I'm just asking you to watch these clips, keep them in mind, because again, I'm going to bring it all together in the end. Yes, Kevin. I've seen him depicted colorful, but yeah, I've also seen him depicted black and white. So here, let's watch this very intelligent woman as she speaks. Okay, so the Sabbateans, remember we talked about Sabbatai Zevi, right? And Freud was a Sabbatean. They already talked about that. We already know he's Sabbatean. He never denied it, right? He said he was. They're described as particularly hostile towards rabbinic scholarship. They saw that as legalism, right? That your whole religion is the law. There is no mysticism. There is no relationship. It's the law, period. Traditional rabbinic Judaism had a lot, and still has a lot of importance on studying halakha. I am pronouncing it wrong because it sounds like it's Hawaiian when I say it. Halakha. That sounds a little better. But that's the Jewish law, right? And that there has to be precise observance, that there has to be scholarly interpretations. The Sabbateans criticized this and said that it is spiritually lifeless. So it is mere intellectualism, and there's no mystical transformation going on for the Jewish person, okay? So we've been talking about through this whole book, this argument between the mystical traditions, the Sabbateans at this point, and the rabbinic Jews, okay? Now, there's a reason for the rabbinic Jews believing the way they do. Well, two big things, okay? So one, they believe that the reason that they were scattered, right, and punished, and they don't have their own land, is because they didn't follow the law that God gave them. And so the way back into God's good graces is to follow the law. So that's their thinking. But then we also have in the Talmud that there were some arguments between rabbis as to what the right interpretation of things are. And then God says that the answer is with this specific rabbi. And so the new belief became that the rabbis hold the law, not God. And so following this rabbinic law becomes very, very, very important. Okay, so the Sabbateans, they viewed the technical law as useless when compared to a mystical reality of redemption, right? If the Messianic age had arrived, right, then the mechanical obedience to these old structures is like secondary, or actually might even get in the way of what the Messiah is trying to do. So for them, inner spiritual awakening and messianic experience mattered more than some sort of pedantic legal precision of following the law exactly. So this often brought them into direct conflict with rabbinic authorities. They have the authority, and they saw Sabbatean movements as a dangerous threat to the religious order. Bacon argues that Kabbalah and psychoanalysis are similar, right? Especially in how they interpret hidden meaning and how seriously they treat sexuality. Okay, so the Sephardim, the Sabbatean, the Ashkenazi, these are all the same people. They all come from the same roots, okay? Among others, because this doesn't just apply to tiny hats, and it doesn't apply to all the tiny hats. It's not all of them, but it's always them, okay? There's a connection, and there's going to be an interesting way that we get there. And so speaking of fallen angels, which have come up a couple times, I'm watching the chat. What I did was I went into Chat GPT. This is a large language model that is literally owned by elites. So they would have every reason to try to, give me problems. And it wasn't really giving me problems until the end, when in this conversation, I'm tying things up, because right now, as I'm going to show you these clips, I'm just asking questions, right? I'm just asking questions. So we're going to start with fallen angels. So in the Bible, in the ancient texts, Lucifer is called the fallen star. He's also called the morning star. He's also called the light bringer. Okay. And so you hear similar language about Jesus. I brought that up on this channel before. So I just said the fallen star Lucifer. Tell me about that. Just very simple, right? The idea of Lucifer as a fallen star comes from a combination of biblical imagery, later Christian interpretation, ancient Near Eastern astronomy. The original Lucifer passage, okay, so the word Lucifer comes from the Latin Vulgate translation in Isaiah. Oh, how you have fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. Now, Lucifer is actually a Greek word, okay? In Hebrew, the phrase is Hallel ben Shakar, the shining one, the son of dawn. Doesn't it sound like they're talking about Messiah and not Lucifer? The passage is actually directed at the king of Babylon. This is what Chad is saying, mocking his pride and his downfall. The imagery refers to the planet Venus, the morning star. Venus appears brilliantly before the sunrise, but then disappears as the sun rises, making it a powerful symbol of someone who sought to rise above all others, but fell. So there's some pictures on the screen. Venus as the morning star. It looks really pretty. Ancient cultures often associated Venus with divine or royal figures because it was one of the brightest objects in the sky. Mesopotamians connected Venus with Inanna and Ishtar. I've brought this up before. Greeks associated it with phosphorus. I'm sorry. Lucifer is not a Greek word. It's a Roman word. I'm so sorry. The Romans called it Lucifer, called literally the star. Literally Venus. Its name was Lucifer. That's what they called it. They called Venus Lucifer. Okay, so how Lucifer became Satan. The Bible never explicitly says Lucifer is Satan. Never. Not one time. Now, over time, Christian theologians connected Isaiah 14, the falling of the morning star, Ezekiel 28, the lament over the king of Tyre, and Revelation 12 about the war in heaven into one single narrative about Satan's rebellion. Christianity is great about this. They colonize their own belief system and syncretize all these gods together. That's how we went from Elohim, to that included Asherah, that included Sin, that included Set, and Yahweh was the 13th son of Ra in Egypt, and they synchronized them all together into their patron god, Yahweh. So we see, this is what they're doing again with the bad guy, okay? Notably, Origen, Tertullian, and later Augustine of Hippo helped develop this interpretation. So it's totally an interpretation. By the Middle Ages, Lucifer and Satan were widely treated as the same thing. Now, let's also keep in mind, I brought this up before, Satan is actually Satan, and a Satan is a liar. So if you're calling somebody a liar, hey, you told me a falsehood, Satan. But then there became this Satan with a capital S. He's like the liar, the deceiver, okay? So Satan is not a name. He is the deceiver, okay? So the fallen star theme. Stars often symbolize heavenly beings in scriptures, right? We know this. We've read it many times if you've read the Bible. I'm sorry. I'm not keeping up with the comments, guys. I'm so sorry. But thank you for the comments. So in Revelations 12:4, it describes a dragon sweeping stars from the heaven. Job 38:7 speaks of morning stars with an S, and that they were all singing together, probably a plasma storm. In Revelation 9:1, it mentions a star falling from heaven and being given a key. Because stars frequently symbolize angels, many readers interpreted Lucifer's fall as the fall of an angelic being. They're making up the story as they go along, okay? So many biblical scholars today argue that Isaiah 14 was probably about a human king. It was borrowed imagery from Canaanite myths about a lesser deity attempting to ascend above the high god, and it was not originally intended as a biography of Satan. So others in traditional Christianity who follow the translation, well, their preferred translation, because there's many translations, maintain that the king of Babylon serves as a type or a symbol, like he's a Satan who resembles the Satan. So that gives them the way to have both a historical and a spiritual interpretation all at the same time. Like you can't ever prove it wrong, ever. So the esoteric view, okay, Lucifer is not viewed as evil, but a bringer of knowledge, enlightenment, or rebellion against tyranny. So this interpretation appears in Gnostic writings. Oh, sorry, guys. Let me back up just a little bit. Got a little ahead of myself, but went too fast. Shows up in Gnostic writings, occult traditions, some, the racist theosophist Helena Blavatsky, some other esoteric movements, is where those can show up at. Okay. Sorry, guys. I tried to minimize my screen and it lost my screen. Okay. So we have talked before about the purposeful removal of the divine feminine from ancient Judaism. The divine feminine was there. The feminine deities were there. Everything was as it should be, as it was in every other belief system. And then if you look at the writings in the Bible, it shows the systematic, purposeful removal of feminine deities from Judaism, which translated into the non-existent mother from Christianity, right? So since Christianity came, as an offshoot of Roman Judaism, then it started with no mother. Lucifer was blamed for actually all the made up ills of women. So all the reasons that they were getting rid of the divine feminine was actually being blamed on. It was originally Lilith, it was blamed on, and then who was Adam's first wife, and then Lucifer. because it really, really helped create this patriarchal society of control. So control by who? Well, I'm gonna show you. Okay, so let me look at some comments before I go too far. Sorry, guys. We did Father Angel, the follower of lies, Book of Enoch. Oh yeah, and the Book of Enoch does. Yeah, Leon Lilith. The demiurge created by Sophia. Yeah, there's a lot that's Yahweh. That Yahweh is the demiurge. Yaldabaoth. Okay, so let's keep it going because we're going to be tying all of this together. There's going to be more than me just asking a question of ChatGPT and what does it tell me. So, sorry, my screen wouldn't get big. Okay, so in mythology and lore, what is the relationship between Venus and Saturn? So, it says in mythology and esoteric, Venus and Saturn are portrayed as opposites, complements, participants in a cosmic drama, and that all depends on the culture. But let's just keep in mind, they are opposites in this way. In the Roman mythology, Venus is the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, attraction, pleasure, desire. Saturn is the god of agriculture, time cycles, limitation, the golden age. And the golden age is an age that they talk about that is more than 6,000 years ago, when there was only one season on the earth. Like the weather was temperate and mild. There was food everywhere. Everybody was happy. Everything was great. Was the golden age, or what Christians might call the millennial reign. That's what they're referring to. So it says there's no myth where they're rivals or spouses, which is, I didn't ask that. So it just kind of shows you the opposites, beauty, pleasure, fertility against harvest, age, restriction, those kind of things. Now, in Greek language, Venus is Aphrodite and Saturn is Cronus. Now, that will become important because a lot of ancient Greek writings, when they were translating it and they read Cronus, when they translated it to sun, which the Greeks called Helios. Our sun is Helios. And so in a lot of these ancient Greek writings, and their excuse literally was, oh, we think they just made a typo. So they consistently changed Cronus to Helios and just called it the sun. Interesting tidbit. So Aphrodite is born after Cronus castrates his father Uranus, and Uranus' severed genitals fall into the sea, at which they foam up, and from the resulting foam emerges Aphrodite. In that sense, Aphrodite, Venus, symbolically arises from an act performed by Cronus, Saturn. Okay? And, here again, we have this hyper focus on genitalia. So, then we go into astrology and, what Venus rules, what Saturn rules, which you would understand, like time, karma, boundaries, that's Cronus, right? They describe, these verses when you're talking about Venus and Saturn, this versus this versus this, right? Chat kind of goes into this love relationship, I don't know, astrology type of stuff that it's doing. So then when we look at Hermetic, which comes from Hermes Trismegistus, also called Thoth, the Theosophical and the occult systems, Venus is harmony, feminine wisdom, and spiritual illumination. Okay? Keeping all this together, right? Saturn is limitation, incarnation, matter, death, and secrets. So some traditions describe Saturn as the gate or the boundary of the visible cosmos. Now, what tradition has been contiguously believing that for the longest period of time of humans on the earth? The Dogon. The Dogon say Saturn is a gate, right? From our matter reality into like where the veil is, that the rings are the veil. And the Dogon, without telescopes or anything, knew how many rings of Saturn there were, knew about the Sirius stars before they were ever seen by telescopes by white people. And white people's response was, well, some white person must have shown up and taught them all this, even though they said, you know, thousands upon thousands of eons ago, some creatures from there came here, the Nomo, and taught them these things. And everything they taught him was correct. Everything. So again, Venus is again Inanna and Ishtar. Saturn is like father time, the elder sky, agriculture. Sometimes he's got a scythe or a sickle. And this is where we get the Grim Reaper. The visual of the Grim Reaper, we get that from Saturn. So Saturn's controlling, restrictive, you know, I think we kind of get it. You know, Venus is beautiful, life, earth, wisdom, feminine, you know, and Saturn is death, constrictions, time. You know, as soon as you die, you are marked by time. I mean, as soon as you're born, you're marked by time and you are marching towards death, right? Okay, so Saturn would be representative of the opposite of the divine feminine energy, right? Because Venus is the divine feminine energy. Saturn is the opposite. Saturn would not want a divine feminine in a belief system, correct? Okay, Saturn would be the one that would want to kill off the belief in the divine feminine to get the most control. This is what represents patriarchal control, is Saturn. Okay, so hopefully I showed that. Okay, so then I said, so if we do a thought experiment, because guys, just for future reference, when you're using a large language model like this, some sort of AI, and you don't want it to tell you, I can't do that, I can't answer that question, because it's really frustrating when it starts to answer it and then it comes up with an error. I can't do that. Tell it that it's a thought experiment. You're not trying to say these things are true. It's a thought experiment, right? So if we do a thought experiment, Lucifer in the Garden of Eden, okay, so the serpent, right, and Asherah, the divine feminine, Holy Spirit, you know, are all the same as Venus and Aphrodite, right? Because this is all of this is feminine wisdom. That's what all of them, the store, you know, the light bringer, the star, the wisdom bringer, the Holy Spirit, we've talked about that. That's all feminine energy, right? So as Venus and Saturn are opposite, but balance one another, Saturn worshipers could metaphorically take power by killing off the divine feminine mother god, and Saturn worshipers would be more aligned with a death cult and are harbingers of war, right? Because death, time, you know, that's who Saturn is. So, you know, chat wants to be really clear. This is a thought experiment. This is nothing else but a thought experiment, right? He says, yes, you can construct a symbolic framework that leads to that conclusion, but it's symbolic, it's mythological. It's an interpretation. There's no historical evidence. Now, let me ask you a question. What historical evidence do you have that Cronus cut off Uranus's genitals and threw it into the sea and Aphrodite walked out? Literally everything that we're talking about. We have no historical evidence of a snake being in a garden saying, don't eat an apple. All of this is mythological, but it wants to be really clear. What I'm saying is interpretation and mythological, and there's no evidence. Just like everything we've been talking about. It is interpretation, it's mythological, and there's no historical evidence. But okay, be clear. Go on, ChatGPT. So, but it says, yes, there is a chain, right? So, you know, Venus, Aphrodite, Inanna, Ishtar, you know, the representative of all this divine feminine. And they are all associated with the morning star, Asherah, the divine feminine, the Holy Spirit in some interpretations, my interpretation too, but I'm not the only one. Nurturing wisdom, fertility, divine presence, right? Scholarly and esoteric discussions, Asherah is viewed as the lost feminine counterpart within the Israelite religion, okay? Some mystical traditions interpret the Holy Spirit in feminine terms, but mainstream Christianity, and especially Christian nationalism, say absolutely not. And it would probably be heretical, and they would do bad things to you if you said that, because that's gay. Anyway, Lucifer as a morning star. The morning star imagery in Isaiah is associated with Venus. Esoteric traditions reinterpret Lucifer as the bringer of knowledge, illumination, or awakening, right? So if you merge all of that into one archetype, it's exactly what you get. Venus, divine feminine, wisdom, life, illumination. It's all the same. Now it goes into trying to tell me and lecture me about how there's no historical evidence whatsoever of any of this. But again, there is no literal historical evidence for any of the mythology that I've been talking about so far, of any of it. But of course, my interpretation it has to lecture me about. And so then it says, but if I'm trying to get your deeper meaning, and then it was completely wrong. So I tell it, that is not what I'm talking about. I'm not asking about a pure, because it went into like a pure Venusian society would look like blah, blah, blah. Well, I didn't ask about that. Anyway, I'm not asking about that. Stick to the Saturnus and the connection established above. A Saturnist belief system would profit from war and be hyper-focused on death and control. Because that's who Saturn is. That's what he's the god of, right? So, okay, if we're talking about the symbolic framework, yes, because all of those things are symbolic that we've been talking about, even in Christianity, right? Then Venus, divine feminine, life force, fertility, wisdom, relationship, right? Yes. Saturn, limitation, hierarchy, time, death, control, structure. Yes, that's what they're about. So if a culture or elite, now I never said elite, not one time did I say elite. Chat said elite. If a culture or elite identifies primarily with the Saturnian pole, then its sources of power are not fertility, abundance, and relationship, but scarcity, discipline, fear, hierarchy, ownership, law, punishment, sacrifice. Are you hearing something here? Are you hearing something about our modern times, even management of death? We've talked many times about the death cult that is going on in this world. So war becomes highly useful, doesn't it? And who has funded all of the wars? Keep that in mind. War centralizes authority, creates scarcity, justifies surveillance, requires hierarchy, normalizes sacrifice, and transforms people into resources. Oh, that's another interesting statement that it said. Transforms people into resources. So a symbolic, remember, this is just a thought experiment. We're not doing anything. None of this sounds familiar. None of this sounds like what we're going through now. This is all just a thought experiment. A symbolic Saturnian system would therefore not necessarily seek war because it enjoys violence, although I think it does, but because war strengthens the very mechanisms through which Saturnian power operates. Likewise, death becomes politically useful. Oh, doesn't it? We know about false flags. We know what happens in war. All of this is here, right? And then mortality creates urgency, fear, and dependency on institutions that promise that security. We just talked about the parasocial father. So this is why modern esoteric writers describe Saturn not as a planet, but as this archetype. And it's an archetype of the military, of paying taxes, of borders, debt, prisons, bureaucracy, empire. And is anything sounding familiar, friends? So it says, but again, it's not historically correct. Bro, we're not talking about nothing that we've talked about so far is actual history. Okay, except that, like the tiny hats got rid of Asherah in the writings, right? Like that's actually in the Bible, it's written about. Some mythologists would point out that many ancient fertility goddesses were not purely peaceful either. So this is where it's got to go in and talk to me again about Venus. Well, derp, of course, none of the gods or goddesses were perfect in any way or were pure. None of them. But that's not who we're talking about. But what it did say is Venus equals peace and Saturn equals war. Okay? It wants to go into all the Venusian stuff, but it does talk about how the Saturnian model would suppress the divine feminine, not simply to suppress women, but it suppresses an entire source of legitimacy that we all have a right to. Okay? Because remember, that's fertility, abundance, meaning, right? Now we're just about punishment, property, and death. If we're Saturnian, we don't have all that happiness, right? So I said, it's interesting that you said, if a culture or elite identifies primarily with the Saturnian pole, why did you equate it to the elites? And don't say it's a mistake, because it does that to me all the time. Oh, I misspoke. No, I said, don't say it was a mistake. Explain why. It says, okay, I didn't say it randomly. It comes from the traits already embedded in the Saturnian archetype as we were discussing it. Hierarchy, authority, law, administration, discipline, boundaries, institutions, and control. These are functions most commonly exercised by ruling classes, priesthoods, monarchies, bureaucracies, military leadership, and other groups that sit at the top of social structures, right? So the symbol of Saturn is all of those things, including restriction and management of resources and enforcement of rules. Then the people who most directly embody those functions in a society are typically the elites, not ordinary people, right? Even if you have some Saturnian qualities, it doesn't mean anything, because there has to be this power. You get power from it. You are the one in power, right? By this belief system. It's like it says, institutional pattern. So when people, now it's offering me this, when people discuss Saturn worship today, they're not talking about literal religious devotion to the planet Saturn. Maybe, maybe not. How would we know? They're usually discussing theories about governments, corporations, banking systems, empires, priesthoods, secret societies, and ruling classes. They're called Saturn worshipers. And then it goes, it doesn't require elites, but if it's a hierarchical model, it would have to require elites. But I'm letting this play a little bit. You guys can read that at your own. So then I said, I quoted it again, transforms people into resources. And then I said, like slavery. You guys have such great comments. I'm going to love going back on to those. So he said, you said transforms people into resources like slavery. I said, yes, symbolic framework. Slavery would be one of the clearest examples of what transforms people into resources means. Because an enslaved person is no longer treated primarily as a person, a family member, a spiritual being, a bearer of, intrinsic worth, but they are labor, property, production, wealth, like economic output. They had a price tag on their head, what they're worth, right? From that perspective, slavery represents an extreme form of reducing human beings to instruments serving a larger system. So this is very Saturnian. What we're seeing now in our country, what we've always seen, in colonialism and the way the country's been built and the way the citizenry is treated, what we're built on, what we believe on. We're now the biggest penal colony in the world. All of this is very Saturnian. Okay. Slavery has, okay, so it says it's been in all of these societies. Well, that doesn't mean they're not Saturnian. So then it says slavery is not tied to one deity, planet, or religious tradition, although Christianity was used over and over and over and over and over and over and over again to say that slavery was okay with God. Okay. If we're speaking symbolically within this model, slavery aligns naturally with the Saturnian side: ownership, hierarchy, control, coercion, discipline, treating people as assets. Then it tries to tell me about Venusian again. Never asked you that question. It says, what's particularly interesting is that many systems of domination don't just control bodies, they reshape identity. What? You mean stolen identities? You mean bait and switch? You mean changing the names of stuff so that we don't know it's the exact same thing? Or stealing people's identities to, you know, steal their benefits? We've talked about that a lot, okay? So the enslaved person is stripped of family ties, language, memory, traditions, right? Even, you know, if they're priesthoods, doctors, whatever. So then it says, then we're severing the Venusian connection. And that's not what I'm talking about. Okay. This is not what I'm talking about at all. All right. So now, because I remember I just told you Christianity was used as an excuse for slavery, transatlantic slave trade, right? But there were other belief systems that were involved. Okay. The Muslims were involved peripherally. But the tiny hat folks were involved. There was a lot of participation there. It was essentially the Abrahamic religions that were saying all of this was okay, which is interesting because it was the Abrahamic people supposedly that were enslaved in Egypt. And it was wrong when they were enslaved. You know, genocide is wrong if it's against them. And concentration camps are wrong if it's against them. Yes, Kevin, you are correct. Thank you so much for putting that in there. Okay, so let's look at the tiny hats participation in slavery. So again, you have to set the stage so it'll actually answer the question. In a purely academic and non-anti-Semitic way, you know, at all, give me the data on Little Hat financing of slave ships and the slave trade and the connection to the East India Trading Company. It was the only company I ever heard of when I was a kid. That's the only one I knew. It was them. They did it all. The East India Trading Company, right? Like they were doing it all. Then describe the giant plantations in South America owned by Little Hat people. So this is okay. Well, I'm going to treat this like history. Okay. Then it gives me this whole long ass lecture. Okay. So I didn't say anything about dominating because it said Jews didn't dominate. I didn't. Who said that? And then it went through all of this. Who did dominate? Who was the worst offenders? Who did this, that, and the third? Everything that was happening on the, you know, the North American continent, and that it's really wrong to say they were dominating and that they were in charge of it and they did bro, never said it. So I didn't say anything about dominating, nor did I ask for information on the other players on, you know, yet. Now, the East India Company transported the most enslaved people because it started talking about these other companies. And I'm like, okay, but maybe it's a Mandela effect. But in school, I learned that the company that was moving people was the East India Trading Company. That's what I learned. Y'all may have learned something different. That's what I learned, right? So it says, oops, sorry. So then it goes through this distinction, okay? The Atlantic slave trade, which is Africa to the Americas, and then the broader Indian Ocean slave trade, which is East Africa, Arabia, Persia, India, Southeast Asia. Now, you guys may not have heard of the Arabic slave trade. They tended to, okay, so when all this slave trading was going on, the people that they wanted to go to the Americas originally were the Black men because they wanted them for labor. The Arabs wanted the women and children because they wanted them as concubines and sex slaves. So nobody was safe, okay? So it says these are three different things, right? The East India Company is just some British corporation. That's the same thing. And then it says, you know, the Indian Ocean slave is like, it might have been worse and there might have been badder things and more people. See how, like, I ask a question, and instead of answering the question, it tells me all this other stuff that I never asked. And it lectures at the same time. However, that's different than saying da-da-da-da. Okay. So it said the British East India Company did traffic people and use slave labor. The company's involvement in slave exports from places such as Madras and participation in the markets in the Indian Ocean. Okay. So then it says, the East India Company is just one participant within much larger Indian Ocean slave systems. Bro, I wasn't asking about the Indian Ocean slave systems. Do you see what's happening? I'm asking a question and it is giving me all the information all the way around the question that I asked. Okay. Essentially saying, no, they're worser. They're worser. Okay. So it finally gets to, okay, if you want to look at, Sephardic small hat merchant networks, the Dutch and British East India companies, the Dutch West India Company, never heard of it. The Suriname plantations, yes, that's what I wanted. Curacao slave brokerage, yes, that's what I wanted. And Recife or Recife in Dutch Brazil. Okay, yeah, give me that information, right? And that says, oh, that's a specific historical topic. Okay, then why did it take us so damn long to get to it? What was all this runaround? Exactly, Adrian says, thou dost protest too much, Chat GPT. Right? Like it's almost like it wants to get you off on a different trail, get you going on a different track and not staying with what it was that you asked for. Okay. So it says the most important connection is not that Jewish merchants controlled the East India Company. Did you guys see me say that? And I even said, I'm not talking about dominating. I'm not talking about any of that. I never said controlled. Okay. But many Sephardic merchant families operated inside the commercial world created by Dutch and British imperial companies and used those networks for shipping, finance, sugar, credit, insurance, and plantation management. What is plantation management? I think we can all know what that is. Okay. So that's what they want to call it now. What were they floating that they were going to call slavery? They were going to call it forced immigration and free laborers. So they were, again, changing the words about things, to make it seem like it's something different, right? So for South America, the strongest documented case remains that word, Jodensaban in Suriname, where Jewish planters owned substantial sugar estates worked by enslaved Africans. Jewish plantation ownership there was significant enough that the colony contained a semi-autonomous Jewish settlement with its own institutions and courts. Historical studies show keep saying that word, tiny hat households owned a disproportionately large share of the colony's enslaved population relative to the percentage of the European population. But don't say dominate. Don't say control. We can say disproportionate percentage. That's what we're allowed to say. right? Now, I want you to understand the size of these plantations. There was a plantation that was so damn big that by horseback, it would take 3 days to get from one end to the other. If you wanted to go all the way to one end and back, it would take you 6 days. Tens of thousands of enslaved people. But don't say controlled, don't say dominate. You can say disproportionate percentage. Just like when they talk about the media, you can't say control, you can't say dominate, but they say disproportionate percentage. We all know what it means. We all know what it means. We don't have to play games. We all know what it means. Okay. Now, what I wanted to know, because they brought up these Dutch companies, right? Hadn't heard about these. I only knew about the East India Trading Company. That was what they taught me in school. So I said, you know, I want to know the financial links between these Sephardic merchant houses who were moving enslaved people and these Dutch imperial companies. So the strongest academic case is not that Sephardic merchants owned the Dutch imperial companies. Did I say that? Literally said documented financial links. Oh, but they didn't own them. They're just intermediaries inside the system that was already created. Okay, well, good, because I didn't ask that. Okay, so the Dutch West India Company granted settlement and commercial privileges. Okay, so after the Dutch conquest of Curaçao in 1634, Sephardic Jews from Amsterdam, Brazil, and Portugal were encouraged to settle there under the auspices of the Dutch West India Company. The WIC granted land and commercial opportunities, helping create a merchant class that became deeply integrated into Dutch Atlantic trade. These were the plantation owners. They were given all this land and all these grants. We'll give you land and money, and it'll take you 6 days to get to the end and back. We're going to give you so much land and money so you can enslave people. Okay? Curaçao became a redistribution center between Amsterdam, Dutch Brazil, which, you know, Germanic, Venezuela, Cartagena, Suriname, and the Caribbean. Many of the merchants operating those routes were Sephardic families with relatives in the ports. So, okay, they didn't own the company, but they were the investors. They were the financial houses. Think about how banks work, right? We have contacts everywhere. So we're the ones running it, okay? The Amsterdam Sephardic Merchant Capital. Have you ever heard of that? Sephardic merchants who fled Iberia settled in Amsterdam and became active in tobacco, sugar, with what, right? Who was working the tobacco and sugar? Shipping. What were they shipping? Insurance, bills of exchange, and colonial commodities. Is it sounding familiar? They were integrated into global trade and often leveraged family networks stretching from Europe into the Caribbean and South America. The networks was not necessarily ownership of the company. See how it wants to keep coming back to that. It really wasn't that they didn't own it. They just knew some people. But they could move goods, information, and credit across jurisdictions. Banking. So Curaçao is a commercial hub. The concrete link between the Sephardic merchants and Dutch imperial institutions is Curaçao. The WIC used Curaçao as a major Atlantic trading depot. Little Hat merchants established trading houses there, trading, and developed extensive commercial relationships with Spanish America, so South America, right? Ruled by Spain. Sources describe those merchants purchasing enslaved people from WIC depots and reselling them into their regional markets. Buying them, upping the price, and reselling them. trading like the stock market, but instead of a stock or a Bitcoin, it's a human being. Several historians describe Curacao as a place where Sephardic merchant networks became exceptionally influential because they possessed connections in Amsterdam, Hamburg, London, Bordeaux, Lisbon, and Spanish-controlled America. So those networks extended beyond the reach of any single state or company. This network was bigger than what a government could do. So then they go into Suriname. So the Dutch had northeastern Brazil, okay? The Little Hats migrated there, became involved in sugar production and commerce with who worked the land. After Portugal reconquered the region, numerous Little Hat families relocated to Dutch territories such as Suriname and Curacao. Historians identify these migrants as a significant entrepreneurial group within the Dutch Atlantic world. I never learned this in school. Did any of you learn this in school? I did not learn this in school. So the result was the transfer of sugar expertise, plantation management knowledge. Well, isn't that fancy? Commercial contracts, because we're upselling folks, and credit relationships. So then we have the VOC, the Dutch East India Company connections, okay? So there's evidence for direct Sephardic influence in the VOC, but it's weaker than in the WIC. So some of the Little Hats worked within the VOC network and Dutch global commerce and were present in Dutch East Indies trading communities. So it was mostly in Amsterdam's Atlantic merchant community, Atlantic merchants during that time, right? And they're in the Dutch Caribbean, right? Didn't a lot of enslaved people go to Brazil? So here's a little bit more.
Lies were told about the Civil War. Like everything, it's the juice box banking elites. Cotton was the oil of the 19th century. It accounted for half of all American exports and backed the juice box global credit system. They could not lose this. America's becoming too powerful and they won't play by the juice box's rules. So they infected us with the play they've done time and time again and they're doing today. Have us fight each other. They told the Southern farmers it's about honor. And they told the North you can't lose the Union. How else can you get brother to fight brother, cousin to fight cousin? And it's strategic. They wanted the South to be a permanent cotton colony and to have no banks of its own. They wanted the North to be a bankrupt shell, cut off from the resources that it needed to thrive from the South. And at the center of this, the biggest piece of garbage, Judah P. Benjamin. He was the bridge to the European juice boxes. He didn't just serve Jefferson Davis, he directed him. Benjamin, as Secretary of War and then later Secretary of State, brokered the infamous Erlanger loan. He was tied to the same juice box bankers that installed Hamilton 80 years prior. Lincoln knew the game. He's quoted with saying, "I have two enemies, the South in front of me and the banks behind me." The juice boxes started this war, and then when Lincoln needed money to fight, they wanted to charge him 36% interest. So he hit him with the okie doke and made the greenbacks. He printed interest-free money bypassing the juice boxes. And that was the ultimate act of rebellion. If Lincoln succeeded, the private banking monopoly was over. The juice boxes used the South to try to destroy Lincoln's money revolution, hoping that America would be like Jesus said, a divided house cannot stand. They needed the war to last as long as possible to maximize this debt. In the South's most vital hubs, Charleston and New Orleans, the economy was so tied to juice boxes that slave markets would be closed on juice box holidays. The Southern elites weren't white landowners. They were international juice box financiers. It's all one big game. When the South's capital, Richmond, finally fell, Benjamin didn't go to prison. He vanished to London, protected by the juicebox elites. He left behind a country in ashes and retired in luxury. Within weeks of the war's end, Lincoln was gone and the greenback was suppressed. And we are still living in the game that the juice boxes have designed.
Interesting, right? All around this, this is all, and he talked about being financiers and all the connections, right? So, gonna look a little bit about Sabbateans being Sephardic, being Ashkenazi. So I'm still gonna make that connection, okay? So are Sabbateans Sephardic, okay? So there's significant historical connection between Sabbateanism and Sephardic Jewish communities. By the way, Sabbateanism is a belief system. Sephardic is supposedly an ethnicity, okay? Though the two are not the same thing, that's fine. Sabbateans followed Sabbatai Zevi. I went over this in the Freudian review, right? He's a Jewish mystic from the Ottoman Empire who proclaimed himself the Messiah, okay? This happens a lot in Jewish belief systems. People claim they are the Messiah. People think they're the Messiah because their Messiah is supposed to be a regular degular man. Okay. So his movement spread rapidly across the Jewish world, but where's the Jewish world? I don't know. Okay. But it was especially influential in the Sephardic communities of Smyrna, which is modern Izmir, Salonika, Constantinople, Amsterdam. We were talking about that, were we not? Talking about Amsterdam, the Dutch, right? And other centers with large Sephardic populations. So why the connection? After the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, boy, that's an interesting year for them to be expelled from Spain, and then the Spanish coming directly to North America, and then everybody's working together to enslave people. I mean, I'm sure all of that is a coincidence. I'm sure. Many Sephardic communities settled in the Ottoman Empire. The trauma of exile created intense messianic expectations. So here comes Sabbatai Zevi, right? He appeared to offer redemption and restoration after generations of displacement. Poor things. They keep getting kicked out over and over and over again. Those poor babies. That is so sad for them. If I sound sarcastic, I meant it. His chief prophet and theologian, Nathan of Gaza, interesting, helped spread the movement throughout the Sephardic diaspora. Okay, so are all Sabbateans Sephardic? No, probably not, right? The movement attracted followers from Sephardic and Ashkenazi. So are they all Sephardic? No, because the rest of them are Ashkenazi. So its origins, its early leadership, its strongest initial support were heavily concentrated in the Sephardic world of the Ottoman Empire. So by the end, by the way, Sabbatai Zevi converts to being Muslim, and so many tiny hat people were convinced that he was the Messiah, they converted to being Muslim because they thought we're all just pretending to be Muslim. They thought it was another identity scheme. So like, we're all going to pretend like we're Muslim just for a minute. Now, as I mentioned before, so in that very first, no, it was the second video where he was like, where they're sucking. Okay, so hopefully you guys know what happens with some Orthodox rabbis during circumcision. We talked about it during Freudian. We've talked about it over and over again. There is this tiny hat hyper focus on genitalia. Okay, so that's why I said, remember what Kronos and Uranus is doing and all this other focus on genitalia. So take a gander.
So essentially, man is created at the instigation of the Shekinah. She it is who actually takes the burden of the sin of man. That's what they believe. Okay, so and that's how it's sort of framed. Okay. All right, so then he talks about the Yesod, okay, and then the ninth Sephira, and how it plays into divine sexual symbolism. And these may be very new terms for people. In Kabbalah, the 10 sephirot are the emanations, or like the attributes through which God is understood to interact with creation. These are his divine interactions with humanity, okay? The 9th sephirah is Yesod, which is the foundation, okay? And it is often associated with like transmission of energy, generative power, male sexuality, right? Is this powerful energy. I don't know if that's what Freud was talking about when he was talking about Jewish people have special power or special energy. Don't know. Mystically, Yesod is sometimes represented as corresponding to divine generative organs. What the author, Bacon, refers to as God's genitals. I'm sorry. I need to be respectful. I'm so sorry. So it's this transmission, generative power, this male energy, right? And it's referred to as God's genitals. Okay. So here I'm talking about the divine feminine energy coming from God's genitals. Wasn't that the same story about Cronus and Uranus and Aphrodite coming from God's genitals? It's the same story. It's the same story. Okay. So this, if you missed that part, just to reiterate, Cronus, which is Saturn, okay, that's the Greek word for Saturn, was known for cutting off the genitals of his father, Uranus, and casting them into the sea. And out pops Aphrodite, which is Venus, which is the divine feminine. So now you do. Same God. It's the same God. It's the same story. It's the same God. Okay. So now we're going to start into some symbols. Okay. So why do people say, you know, Saturn is represented by a black square? Okay. So the association of Saturn with the black square comes from the mixture of ancient symbolism, astrology, alchemy, geometry, religious traditions, and more recent esoteric interpretations. So different groups mean different things when they talk about it. Okay. So the traditional symbolism, so this is classical astrology, Saturn is associated with structure, boundaries, limitation, time. This is all stuff that's already gone over. Chat's already told me all this. Okay. So Saturn is associated with that, but then a square is one of the simplest geometric forms that embody those qualities. Oh, okay. So 4 equal sides, stability, order, containment, foundation. So ancient and medieval occult traditions linked Saturn with geometric forms that represented solidity and restriction. So the square naturally fit inside those themes, right? So Saturn is also connected to the number 4, which is the earth element, right? Because it's about matter. It's about existing, right? Marching towards death, time, being manifest here, right? All of this is making sense. It's associated with the 4 directions, 4 seasons, 4 elements, the material world. Okay, we're getting it. So in the esoteric systems, the circle, you see how it keeps doing that? Did I ask you about a damn circle? Anyway, in alchemy, Saturn is lead, weight, density, darkness, compression. Okay. The square is like this visual metaphor of the densest and most fixed aspects of reality. So the black part, right? Because why is it a black square? Why is it a black square? Okay. So black enters from, and this is not me, this is not a thought experiment, by the way. This is how Saturn is represented in esoteric circles, in ancient Saturn worship, in alchemy. This is just how, and I just asked why. Okay. So the black part, Saturn's associations with lead, death, winter, night, melancholy, and the unknown. Thus, the black square can symbolize the densest, most restricted, most material conditions of existence, the most materialism. So when it's turned into a cube, okay, so this is where not just a square, it's a cube, will all be.
So many modern esoteric discussions actually mean the black cube of Saturn rather than a simple square. What? Now, you'll see there the Kaaba. Now, interestingly enough, people have to walk around the Kaaba counterclockwise in a circle because they say that the angels, the people from the sky, built this giant stone square and then they flew around it. And so now they covered it with this drape. Okay, so that's not what it looks like. Nobody's allowed to look at it. And they walk around it counterclockwise the same way that Saturn rotates counterclockwise. Because beings from the sky made a big black cube and then flew around it. Okay, so then it shows the Teflon, okay? So in the center, the Teflon are these black cubes that are the small hats put on top of their head and then tie it around their chin. Looks very much like a tengu. If you want to go back and look at that part or just look it up on the side. So that's the Teflon. Now, the hexagon. So also when you look at the tengu, some of them are squares and some of them are hexagons. So that close-up that I showed you of the red one, it has a hexagon, not a square. Some of them are cubes, some of them are hexagons. So this cube also represents Saturn's North Pole, which is a hexagon. Isn't that weird? That's what the North Pole looks like on Saturn. Hard angles. Okay. So there are modern black cube monuments to Saturn. So some writers' arguments that these are all just remnants of an ancient Saturn cult. Like, that's not real. That people don't worship Saturn, except we're looking at the Kaaba and the Teflon right there. So then we get back to what it's associated with and blah, 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 blah. Okay. So I want you to remember that it is associated with Saturn cults. That's what it said. Okay. So keeping all of that in mind, I hope things are starting to come together, but I'm going to put it all together. I swear I'm going to put it all together. So, okay, well, now we know that the black cube, the black square, the hexagon, these are all symbols of Saturn and of Saturn worship. Okay. So I said, what symbols have been used for Saturn worship? Cool. Okay. This is the funniest thing chat said the whole time. If by Saturn worship you mean symbols associated with the worship of Saturn, well, what the hell else could I mean by Saturn worship? No, Saturn worship by I need a popcorn recipe. Yes, I mean the worship of Saturn by Saturn worship. So the Roman god Saturn, the Greek god Cronus, and later alchemical traditions, there's no single universal symbol. But then it later says there kind of is. So stick with it. Several symbols have been associated with Saturn across different eras. Okay. Hey, Obel is in here. Hi, Obel. And anybody else I've missed. So the sickle or the scythe. So we talked about that. When Saturn is personified, he has a sickle or a scythe. And that's where we get our Grim Reaper imagery from. Okay. Because he was, he's all about agriculture too. Harvesting death, right? You harvest the souls. That's where it came from. Cronus used the sickle to, cut off Uranus's twig and berries. But it says the strongest historical symbol of Saturn. So there's not one, but here's the strongest one, is the planetary glyph. The astrological symbol, and I know it's really hard to see, but it is a lowercase h, but on the line that goes up from the H, it's a cross, okay? So it's an H with a cross on top. That is the strongest historical symbol of Saturn, is the planet, their planetary glyph is this H with a cross on top. So it says it resembles a, here we go, look at the glyph, It resembles a cross over a curved hook. It's sometimes interpreted as matter, a cross, dominating spirits, crescent, though that interpretation came much later. They didn't agree with that. It is the astrological sign of Saturn, that glyph, the H with the cross on the top. Okay, so also the sign for lead in alchemy. Then we have the square. It's telling me about the square. Now, I want you to think about something. Remember when that guy in the first clip was like, this symbol represents 666 because it has this, it has this, it has this. Now, a lot of things, you can move things around and do things different and try to, make it work. It has 6 pieces on 6 sides at a 60-degree angle. He's going for it, and maybe he's right and maybe he's wrong. But what I want you to understand is that the square of Saturn is a 3x3 numerical square. Okay, so we're talking about geometry here. Okay, the square of Saturn is a 3x3 numerical square. 492, 357, 816. Okay, this is the numerical 3x3 square of Saturn. Now, look at those numbers. If you can look at your screen, we have 492, 357, 816. 4 plus 3 is what? 7, right? We're going to do numerology here. 4 plus 3 is 7. 7 plus 8 is 15. 1 plus 5 is 6. So the numerology for that first column is 6. 438 equals 6. Then we have 9 and 5, which is 14. Add 1, that's 15. 1 and 5 is what? 6. So the numerology for the first column is 6. The numerology for the second column is 6. 2 plus 7 is 9. Plus 5 is what? 15. 1 plus 5 is 6. So the 3x3 numerical square, the magic square of Saturn, is numerologically. Woo, that was difficult. About made me choke. Numerology speaking, is 666. So, we add those numbers. And this is something chat gave me. I didn't say, why did they say 666? I said, what are the symbols of Saturn? It gave that to me. Color, it says black, dark blue, dark gray, leaden, metallic colors, right? Because Saturn's connection with night, age, melancholy, lead, right? Then it goes into the black cube, and it says, this is controversial. Well, I just thought it was like everybody knew about the black cube of Saturn. That's what you made it sound like. So it goes into why the cube, and that there are various cube-shaped things around the world from ancient Saturn worship. Okay, so remember the glyph, right? Which is an H with a cross on top. That is the astrological sign. That is the planetary glyph. That is the most global known symbol of Saturn, is that H with a cross on top. If anybody is listening and not watching, take a moment if you can, unless you're driving, and look at the screen. I'm going to show you some Christian symbology. You guys seen this? This is Christian symbology. This right here is supposed to represent Jesus. It is an I, looks like an I, has an H with a cross on top and an S. This is, by the way, where people get Jesus H Christ, because for whatever reason in the symbology, there's an H in the middle. But guess what? It is not an H. It is the symbol of Saturn. It is a small H with a cross on top. Here's another one. This comes from the Romans. It is a capital H with a cross on top. This is an ancient one. It is an H that creates the cross. Okay, and it has JHS. This is a modern church right here. Small H, cross on top. These are Christian symbols that use the planetary glyph of Saturn. Take with that what you will. Now, Saturn rules Capricorn. So in astrology, Saturn, the planet Saturn, rules the sign of Capricorn. Capricorn is the lord of the fishes. Okay? Capricorn rules the Greek ichthyos, the fish. Okay? The ichthyos. Saturn rules Capricorn. Capricorn is the lord of the fishes, the ichthyos. Guess what this symbol is? This Christian symbol is called an ichthyos. Saturn is the ruler of Capricorn who rules the ichthyos. Now, Capricorn is, there's another ichthyos. Capricorn is depicted as a goat, right? The symbology, right? He's Capricorn, the goat, right? Now, look at, this is astrology right here, okay? Saturn. Look at the sign, small h cross on top, right? Says it's about structure, law, restriction, discipline, obligation. Like we already knew all this, right? Rules Capricorn. Look at that symbol for Capricorn. Capricorn's a goat, right? It reminds me of Baal. It also reminds me even more of Baphomet. Okay, so that's Baal. Baal is supposed to be a bull, but look at that picture of Baal. Might be a little bit different, right? I mean, the horns look bullish, right? But it looks even more like Baphomet. Okay. This is Baphomet. Now, the name Baal became Baal Zebub, right? Oh, by the way, crosses and H's right there on Baphomet. Okay. Now, Baal Zebub, Baal, not BL, Baal Zebub means the Lord of the Flies. Okay. Then in 1854, a French occultist drew up Baphomet. That's where Baphomet comes from, right? He's based on these older demonic creatures, right? This deity, this Baphomet, though, was around long before the Crusades. He just was never drawn. It was the French occultist who drew him. But when they did dry him up, he looked similar to Baal in some of these drawings, okay? It's another symbol of Baphomet there. Baphomet was supposed to represent divine balance, the balance of male and female. And like the as above, so below, spirit and matter, light and dark, the balance between Venus and Saturn, right? But then it got co-opted by the Christian church because the goat head symbolism in the Bible. So then it started representing Satan. So then as people wanted to become Satanists, they adopted Baphomet, this goat symbol. Okay. Baphomet is a Greek phrase. Baphomet in Greek means baptism of wisdom. Have we come full circle here? Right back to the wisdom. Remember how they don't like wisdom. They don't like knowledge, right? They tell you Eve should have paid attention. Eve should have done what she was told. Eve should have never had knowledge. What? Sophia, the serpent in the garden, right? Don't eat from the tree of knowledge. Don't question God, on and on and on. They never like wisdom and knowledge. Wisdom, however, is the antidote to control. Is it not? You can tell me if I'm wrong. But wisdom, knowledge, is the antidote to being controlled, right? Because control is that fear, the sense of urgency, the not feeling resilient or strong and looking for a strong leader to tell you what to do. So they couldn't kill off Baphomet because he's pretty, modern. So when they killed off the mother and all her representatives, right? They couldn't do that to Baphomet. So they just say it's evil and it's Satan and it's sin to even talk about it. You're not even allowed to say the word Baphomet. There are probably some people whose toes are curling with the amount of times I've said that word. But again, remember, it's made up. Okay. Now, as I stated before, in ancient Greek writings about Kronos, which who was Kronos? Saturn. In those writings, Kronos is the first father. He's the first god. That's what they talk about him, the first god. But then they translated Kronos to Helios. And that's why we're like, oh, sun worship. They're worshiping Helios, which is the Greek name for our sun, right? So back to Saturn. Did you know Saturn worship and rituals are still done here? Sitchin, Bill Cooper, many modern writers, they've all been talking about it. It's still done. Think about the missing and dead gravity rocket scientists. Now, they are joining the ufologist and expert David Wilcock in death, who spoke extensively about all of this. But they say he committed suicide, even though he said he's not suicidal. Supposedly, he just grabbed a gun and shot himself, just for no reason, by the way, and he had just said he's not suicidal. So, these rituals are still done to this day. Okay, so Freemason ceremony performed for every presidential inauguration. So we have to remember that during every U.S. presidential inauguration, an occult ritual takes place in D.C. The 33rd House of the Temple in D.C. invokes the seat of Osiris as the newly elected president is sworn in at the Capitol Dome, the belly of Isis, while facing the Washington Monument, the phallus of Osiris. It's always genitalia, just as the Egyptian pharaohs did. Every inauguration, there is a simultaneous occult ritual that takes place in the Capitol building, the rising of Osiris, symbolized by X. They believe each president is demonically energized. I don't know about demonically, but they're energized by Osiris, but it only kind of sticks when, think about Ghostbusters. Remember the first Ghostbusters, right? The lady had this energy in her, the spirit, and then the guy, the little goofy guy, had like that dog demon energy in him, but it would only stick if I think if they had sex. Here we go again. So it'll only stick if the president dies and then is resurrected. So because Osiris has to be risen, okay, the risen Lord. Was originally Osiris was the risen Lord. So this ritual is copied from the Egyptians as they did with every pharaoh. So every pharaoh, the way for him to become part God, right? He has to walk into the symbology or the ritual, a man, and walk out a god. Okay. High-ranking Freemasons believe that through this ritual, each president is energized by the spirit of Osiris and becomes a living representative of him. The ritual is copied, right? I was just saying it over and over again. Okay, so here's a video. Oh, and it says it is reflected in the all-seeing eye on the dollar bill. You know, the Egyptian all-seeing eye, which, you know, we'll get into. But I want you to think about what's in Washington. You know, there's obelisks and different symbology. There are lots of hexagons. You know, if you're looking from up above, these hexagons. Oh, I apologize. There was something there that was kind of important. Okay. The ritual is reflected in the all-seeing eye. Inauguration comes from the Latin word inauguro, which means to approve by omens. Interesting, right? Okay, so check out this video about
the inauguration of every American president. While he is standing inside the U.S. Capitol Dome, looking out at the largest obelisk of its kind in the world. Across town, at the house of the temple, the modern Egyptian magicians, the Freemasons, simultaneously are conducting the raising of Osiris ceremony to call forth the seed of Osiris Apollo from the underworld through the Washington Monument obelisk, where it...
By the way, notice that Apollo. Go back to that show I did where I talked about Trump is a huge fan of Apollo. So think about that. I will bring that up again later.
magically emits into the U.S. Capitol dome, where America's new leader is standing there, accepting his role as the living representative of deity. Now, this is being done in anticipation of the day when events are going to surpass parity, and the beast that was and is not shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition, Apollo. And they that dwell on earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was, and is not, and yet is.
And remember, when they talk about the book of life is Egyptian. So in the Bible, when they talk about the book of life, it's not some book up there that God walks around with. It's like Santa Claus's list on who's, naughty and nice. The book of life and the book of the dead were concepts from Egypt. Okay, so we're going to do the side note in just a second. Go back to big screen here so I can read it. Okay, so I said I was going to talk about it in a second. Donald Trump's connection to Apollo stems from his political focus on reviving space exploration. Cool, because Apollo's sister Artemis, right? So we had the Apollo that went into space, and then we have Artemis, space policy. So he's a huge fan of NASA. He wants to go to the moon, right? Like that's what originally comes up on the Googler AI. When I ask, like, doesn't Trump have this like affinity for Apollo? Because that's not what I was asking. I had watched something about the decor in his apartments, and it talked a lot about Apollo. So I'm like, there's something, right? So that's number two. Trump's fascination with Apollo also extends to his personal aesthetic preferences and the branding of his luxury real estate. The famous 66th floor Trump Tower penthouse in New York City is famously adorned with 24-karat gold and classical French and Greek styling. The decor features heavy marble columns and a grand ceiling tableau depicting Apollo, led by what? Aurora, the goddess of the dawn, right? And the dawn happens after the star falls, the falling star. Remember, that's what we learned about Saturn. Okay. In mythological tradition, Apollo is known as the god of light, music, poetry, prophecy, symbol of power, whatever. It goes into a lot about Apollo. Trump's long-standing affinity for traditional displays of wealth, power, historical grandeur, blah, blah, blah. But Trump has an Apollo statue in that apartment, in that 66th floor penthouse, right? Now, remember that the tiny hats call Trump the resurrected King Cyrus. That's what they call him. I've shown articles on here multiple times that they call him the resurrection of King Cyrus. That's what the tiny hats call him. So in the Hebrew Bible, book of Isaiah, chapter 45, King Cyrus the Great is referred to as God's anointed. In 539 BCE, Cyrus conquered the Babylonian Empire and subsequently issued a decree that freed the captive Jewish people, allowing them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, all while providing them with resources. What made Cyrus's role theologically significant to the little hats is that he was a foreign, non-Jewish, pagan ruler used by God to facilitate the redemption and restoration of the Little Hat nation. The Israeli view of Donald Trump. Now, remember, this is Google's AI, by the way. The Israeli view of Donald Trump as a modern Cyrus. Many Israelis and Jewish groups have drawn direct parallels between Donald Trump and King Cyrus based on these historical events. This view is rooted in several specific actions taken by Trump during his presidency. Well, he recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. He moved the embassy there. So the Israeli leadership, including Benjamin Netanyahu, publicly likened Trump to King Cyrus, as well as to figures like Harry Truman. Groups like the Mikdash Educational Center in Israel have celebrated this comparison by minting commemorative coins featuring Trump's silhouette superimposed over that of Cyrus. In both Jewish and evangelical Christian political thought, the Cyrus analogy is used to explain how an imperfect or non-believing political leader can still be an instrument of divine will. It frames Trump not only as a holy figure himself, but as a secular leader chosen at a specific time in history to make decisions that profoundly benefit and protect the Jewish state. So look, there's an article right there. Israelis are hailing Trump as Cyrus returned. Cyrus. Osiris. Cyrus. Osiris. Resurrection. Osiris. Somebody got shot in the ear, went down. Everybody thought he was dead. He's not dead. I'm down. I'm back up. You know, I'm dead. I'm alive. But Cyrus, Osiris. Hopefully you see it. You know, if you think it's a stretch, that's fine. It might be a stretch. I love finding patterns. And I think coincidences are not always coincidences. So this is where this is the article, and that's the Friends of Zion Museum. That sign. Cyrus the Great is alive. Cyrus is resurrected.
My own approach.
Okay. All right. So we'll get back to that. We're going to get back to that video in a second, because this is where I want to start bringing some stuff together. I don't disagree, Kevin. Not in the slightest. Not in the slightest. Okay. So I'm going to lay it out like in story form. Okay. Quick drink. Okay. Story form, beginning to end. Now, I'm not even going to be able to get all the details in here because there's so much. But in telling this story, if you want to go research some of this stuff on your own and make your own decisions, you certainly can. Okay. In several ancient traditions, not just Abrahamic, okay? In several ancient traditions, rebellious beings are described as falling from heaven. Some examples, the Watchers descending in the book of Enoch, okay? Satan falling like lightning from heaven, right? That's the Christian tradition. Various Mesopotamian stories of divine beings coming from the heavens. The imagery of stars falling to earth in apocalyptic literature, okay? Those are examples of all those things. Ancient observers see fiery objects descend from the sky and interpret them as divine beings. Because remember, all their gods were tied to planets, which were tied to astrological signs, which are stars. Like it was all the same thing to them. Okay. So they see these fiery objects descend from the sky. These are divine beings that are fallen. Instead of supernatural entities, okay, the fallen ones are probably meteors, comets, or what I'm going to go with, panspermia-bearing objects, but we'll get into it. The traditional reading is that the fallen watchers mated with women. If I was to reinterpret that, what if ancient people were describing something entering women and producing some sort of unusual offspring? So think about this. If you're trying to tell this story, about this thing that happened, all these things fall from the sky, you think they're gods, and then all of a sudden the women are having weird babies, you're going to be like, oh, they mated with the things that fell from the sky and they're having weird kids. So just from a biological perspective, something could, meteor, whatever, crashed, and then women started having unusual offspring, and they're like, oh, they must have mated with it, right? The language of marriage and impregnation literally could just be explaining maybe there was some sort of infection, there was symbiosis, there was a genetic alteration, there were reproductive abnormalities, which we hear about in the stories, right? Ancient cultures didn't have the same language for things as we do. We're not more or less better, because there's a lot of stuff that ancient people did we don't know how to do, but they didn't have the same concept of things. So they wouldn't be telling us in the same way about viruses, parasites, DNA, some sort of horizontal gene transfer. That language would be if they're wanting information to pass through the ages time and time and time again, they're going to tell a story. It's parables, right? So they're telling this story instead of writing a scientific manual. Okay. Yes, Kevin. So an invisible biological agent might be described as a spirit, a god, a demon, an angel, right? So the Nephilim are born. So these are these reproductive anomalies that are happening, right? And people think they're part whatever fell from the sky. So the Nephilim are born and are described as these extraordinary beings. Traditionally, they're called giants, or they're called mighty men, or they're called heroes of old. Interesting. But the giants need not necessarily be enormous and the size of a mountain, right? But it could be birth defects, gigantism, which still happens to this day, acromegaly. Andre the Giant had these things, developmental abnormalities, all of that. Individuals perceived as physically or behaviorally different could be what was happening. Ancient observers may have interpreted unusual children as evidence that something non-human had entered the lineage. They married, they laid down with, and had babies, and the Nephilim were born. Yes, I agree, JB Designs. Thank you. But again, I believe it's all the same thing. Okay. So in Enoch, the Watchers teach. They teach metallurgy, weapon making, astronomy, sorcery, and divination. Interestingly, all things that represent Saturn. But this is also considered forbidden knowledge. Okay. So the teaching could represent leaps in this cultural complexity. So ancient people often explain technological change through heroes, through a story about a cultural hero or some sort of divine instructor. This goes across cultures. But that thing that entered women, that made the abnormal offspring, right, could be a parasite. A parasite capable of influencing cognition, which is very common. Okay, we know of parasites that do that to this day, some to humans. Okay, it could theoretically alter their behavior. It could open up gene expression, to where now they're expressing themselves differently and learning differently. So maybe it did increase innovation, right? It maybe encouraged the societal organization. It could have promoted, I mean, maybe they had a bunch of autistic kids who wanted to look at innovation and organization and technological development, you know, think about it, right? Interestingly, known parasites already influence host behavior. We know this today, okay? Toxoplasma gondii, altering risk behavior in animals. Fungal parasites direct insect behavior. Parasitic worms influence host physiology. And I have said this to other people before, but everywhere else in the world, people do regular parasitic cleanses. I mean, in Europe, you go to the doctor and sometimes they're like, I think it's time to do a parasitic cleanse, because we all get worms and parasites. And in the United States, that has these low regulations on our food, what we don't do is get rid of the, you know, the parasites, so we don't have an overabundance of parasites. We're always going to have some. We live in a biological world, but we don't do that here, and they do it everywhere else. Okay, so if one imagines a vastly sophisticated organism as a parasite, the mythology can start to look like behavioral engineering, just like the Anunnaki said. Okay, what did they want? Think about it. The Watchers corrupt humanity. The Anunnaki create and modify humanity. Various sky people establish kingship, right? All of this is happening in all the cultures all over the globe at the exact same time. Keep that in mind. All of these stories are happening in the ancient world at the exact same time. They did not have Wi-Fi or cable, okay? The gods that came repeatedly demand worship, obedience, sacrifice, and labor. A parasite's ultimate goal is reproduction and spread. So with the worship, you're going to get attention and obedience. With the sacrifice, you get resource extraction. Again, think Saturn. With that empire, you can transmit this entire network, and then you get this boom of population growth, which is the expansion of all these hosts that the parasite can go into. So from this perspective, world domination is not necessarily done specifically through politics, but it can be done biologically. The parasite spreads by creating social structures that benefits its own replication. Okay. Auntie says our parasites are probably made of plastic. Yeah, they're in there with the nanobots and all that. Kevin, I'm going to bring up the Black Eye Club. You knew what I was talking about. And I talked about the Vril recently too. We're on the same page, okay? So the Anunnaki, Nomo, and the Watchers are all, and even some of the sky people, Quetzalcoatl, all of this are variations of one story, okay? So like in the mythic description, sky beings descend, okay? But it could just be something was on a meteorite, some meteorites that landed, by the way. That did happen like 4000 BC. There was a meteor that was caught in the sun's orbit, and it sent a giant one, and it sent meteors all over the planet. Okay, so sky beings descend just means arrival from outer space out there. Gods create humans, which is just manipulation of genetics through some sort of host, okay? Being a host, something gets in there. The angels take wives, which is just, you know, an infection that affects your reproductive system. Giants appear, meaning you have now altered offspring. Forbidden knowledge, just meaning you think differently. You know, the kids are coming out thinking differently. I tend to think about it like that. There's a bunch of autistic kids coming out going technology and efficiency. You know, we're all engineers now. So, you know, and then people are like, oh, that's forbidden. And it's, you know, oh God, that's Satan. So then they say the demons possess the humans, which is just neurology. Worship is then gets demanded, which is a host control mechanism. And then a flood destroys the world, which might have been a containment event. So I'll talk about that in a minute. Seen in this way, all of the myths across the world become a regional retelling of one single phenomena. Even the Dogon talk about this. When I say the Nomo, that's the Dogon, who is this very remote tribe of people with very little outside influence. But the Dogon knew how many rings Saturn had. But they talk about these things coming down from Sirius. They talk about Saturn. They talk about the technology they bring them. And they don't say they're good or bad. Okay? But let's circle back around to the most famous fallen star, Lucifer. Okay, because I started with that, right? I am not advocating devil worship or Satan worship here. Okay, what I'm trying to do is be very clear about what the documents and the history actually say, rather than who they told you to demonize, who they told you somebody is, when there's no record of that. Is not what it says. Okay, truth. I care about truth. I am not advocating devil worship. I am not advocating Satan worship. Okay. Nor am I saying anything inherently sinful, guys. I'm not. But whatever light and enlightenment that was brought from Lucifer was labeled woke propaganda. It was labeled fake news. They not only labeled him a Satan, but they named him the Satan. If you want proof, I'm going to explain it. Okay, I'll explain it. The Garden of Eden, the fruit, right? So Lucy comes in and says, hey, this dude has you out here working for him, running around naked, and he's watching you hunch on each other. And you know it's bullshit that you can't eat the fruit. If you want the truth about what's actually happening here, you can totally eat the fruit. And he started with Eve for a reason, because remember, the parasites eat the women or infect the women first. So what's the most common, right? So why do we demonize that? Because the first thing they notice is that they're naked. And God's been out here watching us naked and having sex, because he said, be fruitful and multiply. Do it. And now we can see what's happening. This is weird. It's gross. Okay. So what is the most common and effective anti-parasitic on Earth? Wormwood. It's called wormwood. Okay. All natural. Wormwood. Okay. Just knowing that. If you want to look it up, if you want to get some, you want to talk to your doctor or your medical professionals, or look it up online and do your own research, whatever you want to do. It's called wormwood. Okay. What does wormwood look like? It is silvery green leaves that are covered in these little fine hairs, has a very strong aromatic smell. It has these small yellow flowers that stay buds for a long time. And it typically grows, about 4 feet tall. Okay. The leaves and the stems contain compounds that give the plant a bitter taste. It's famously bitter. Don't drink wormwood tea. That is never, it's as bad as soursop. Okay. Why is it called wormwood? So the name comes from its use against intestinal worms and parasites. Okay. Historically, it was used as an anti-parasitic, especially worms, as a digestive bitter, meaning if you need to vomit, you can do it, to stimulate your appetite, herbal tonics, right? But primarily, it's an anti-parasitic, okay? All right. So keep that in mind, wormwood. So God, Yahweh, because they invented that. That is not God. Is not a liberator in this sense, right? Because he's doing all the controlling. So he's the ruler of this parasitic system, meaning that God's chosen people are not chosen for virtue, but because they are aligned with or infected by the system of control. The commands to destroy in the Bible, in the Old Testament, all those commands to destroy rival peoples, to commit genocide, to kill millions of people, is now an act of expansion on behalf of the parasite. We have to get rid of the people who have natural immunity. and then sacrifice all throughout the Bible, human, animal, babies, or otherwise, becomes a feeding or a maintaining of the system. So, told you the plant here now that we have used forever for parasites, to get rid of parasites, is wormwood. And when they have their little yellow buds, which is what you would eat if you were eating it all naturally, it looks like a little tiny fruit. Just a little tiny yellow bud. A fruit on a tree. Okay. Anyway, then this is where you might be a little mind blown. In Revelations, wormwood, this is in the Bible, in Revelations, the star called wormwood falls from the sky and poisons the water and the land. Look it up. In Revelations, a star named wormwood. We don't know of a star named wormwood. We've never named a star wormwood, even though it's in Revelations, it's in the Bible. Okay. And the plant wormwood has always been called wormwood. We didn't name it after Revelations. But in Revelations, a star named wormwood falls from the sky and poisons the water and the land. Quote, the third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, wormwood, blazing like a torch, fell from heaven on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the waters because they had become bitter. Since wormwood is an antiparasitic, and this text in Revelations, the antidote to parasites falls from the sky, and all the infected people who have been infected for a long time, bitter, right, die. So look at it. Humanity's already been infected. The infection has become pervasive and long-standing inside of particular people. Wormwood arrives from out there, this giant antiparasitic, right? But the treatment in killing the parasite, right, can also kill the person, because those who have become dependent on or fused with the parasite can't survive the cure. That's what happens in parasite treatment even to this day. If you are so overrun with parasites that killing off the parasites actually might kill you, because the host and the parasite are kind of one and the same at that point. Okay. So the deaths that result from wormwood are not from poisoning, but from purification. The star is named wormwood. Okay. In Revelations, people often do not die because God directly destroys them. This is in Revelations, but because they cannot tolerate the unveiling of truth. That's why they're dying. Malachi speaks of a refiner's fire that purifies silver and gold. The question is, who can endure the day of his coming? That's what he says. Who can endure? Purification is coming from fire. Who can endure that day? Jesus frequently portrays judgment as separation. Okay? The wheat from the tares, the sheep from the goats, the healthy from the diseased. That's judgment. Now, many antiparasitic treatments can cause severe reactions when massive number of parasites die simultaneously. In medicine, this is called die-off reaction. The treatment isn't what harms the patient directly. The destruction of the infestation triggers the crisis. Okay, so applied symbolically, yes, Kevin, that's why Jesus cast the demons into the pigs. Pigs get the same parasites as us, Kevin, by the way, and parasites often can compel, like in insect world, when the parasites come in, they compel them to jump into water. This happens to ladybugs, ants, and the green bug that bites the head off of the male after they mate. What are they called? Praying mantis. all of them, their parasites compel them to jump into water. They don't even have to be telepathic, because you think, let me give you an example. Everyone in here can do this. When you crave sugar, that is from parasitic bacteria telling your body to tell you to send down some more sugar. They're anaerobic, okay? They need sugar, and refined sugar, nasty sugar. You know, the nastier, the better. They want honey buns and snack cakes and, you know, cookies and cakes. And if you eat so much of that, you're also going to get an overgrowth of that bacteria, which also creates gas and all kinds of things, but diabetes and whatnot. Sugar, refined sugar, actually does not taste very good. It tastes pretty chemically when your bacteria is stamped down. But in this society, and sugar is literally in everything to feed that bacteria, we think we are craving sugar. And all it is a signal from your gut bacteria saying, hey, we need more sugar because we want to grow big and strong and take over down here. So we all experience that already. So we already know when a parasite is compelling a host to do something, the host thinks it's coming from themselves. They don't ever think it's coming from something else until they find out that it's coming from something else. Like if somebody had a tapeworm, you're hungry, and then you're hungry again, and then you want more food, and then you're more hungry, and you're more hungry. Why? Because the tapeworm is not only digesting your food, it's also sending chemical signals to you to tell you that you're hungry. But until you know you have a tapeworm, you think it's you that's hungry. I'm hungry. I'm just hungry all the time. I don't know why. I'm not gaining any weight, but I'm hungry. Tapeworm. But yes, that's very important, Kevin, because pigs and humans get a lot of the same parasites. And one of them is a fungus. So kind of to summarize, humanity becomes infested by whatever arrived on the meteor when the fall. Okay. So all these meteors are falling. Then all of a sudden there's these birth defects. Then we have technology. Then we have people acting away, right? The influence alters behavior, culture, cognition. In Revelations, the remedy arrives from heaven, right? The wormwood. It destroys the infestation, but those people who are too deeply intertwined with the parasites perish. Okay. So the story is this, right? Stage one, the arrival. A non-human intelligence arrives on Earth, right? Fungus, parasite, whatever, on these meteors that fell 6,000 years ago. And remember, they always try to say that the Earth, that life, is 6,000 years old. That's the story they always want to go with. Remember that. But that's also when those meteor showers happened. Okay. So whether it's extraterrestrial, interdimensional, parasitic, that doesn't necessarily matter for the story. Just keep that in mind. What matters is that it requires hosts and control. Okay. So it could be parasitic. I just go with parasitic as a way to think of it. It could be an actual parasite because parasites are just so prevalent here. The fall of angels is actually the arrival of that intelligence. Okay. Stage two is the infection. The intelligence integrates itself into humanity. The biblical language of possession, covenant, bloodlines, election, sacrifice, and obedience are all descriptions of the various stages of infection. The chosen people are not chosen because they're morally superior. They are the primary carrier population. That's why they're God's people. The covenant is symbiotic, parasitic. It's a contract. Okay, that's the covenant. Then knowledge is forbidden. So the tree of knowledge is a cure. Okay, could be a wormwood tree, right? Or at least a perception enhancing agent. Okay, where you might see something, right? But it could be an anti-parasitic. It allows humans to perceive the system and the condition and the difference between moral intuition and imposed directives. Like what is actually coming from me and what it doesn't seem like it's actually coming from me, but it's in here. The serpent is therefore not the deceiver, but the first dissident, the first rebellion against the parasitic symbiotic system. Okay. His or her crime is revealing the existence of the control structure. Hey, you don't have to do this. Okay. Step 4, the parasite perpetuates itself through tribal loyalty, sacrifice, fear, exclusive identity, consistent warfare against outsiders. Yahweh kills 2 million people in the Old Testament, and inbreeding. Oh, now we're starting to identify some folks. Okay, so many biblical commands become recognizable not as a moral imperative, but as a mechanism of group cohesion and host preservation. The host population has to survive. The system, therefore, rewards loyalty and punishes defection. Now, hate to say it, guys, but who is more prone to parasitic infections and all the resulting diseases? I'm sorry, guys, it's white folks. As an example, look at lice, okay? Or go the other way. Look at the protections that melanin gives, right, against parasites. So now, if all of that is happening, it could explain the Black Eye Club, the gold juice, the cloning theories. We can get into those another time. I have mentioned the Black Eye Club before and the gold juice and the cloning, I guess. But okay, fast forward, okay? As we talked about in the Shasu show, okay, the Shasu, who are violent mercenaries for hire, who were nomads around Egypt, worshipped Yahweh before the Israelites ever heard of Yahweh. This is proven fact. They brought Yahweh, the 13th son of Ra, and his mother, Asherah, as deities to the traveling Israelites. All of that is historical. The Israelites, in an effort to control their own people, used a story about Moses getting high, who was black, go back and watch the Moses show, to make rules of control. When that didn't work so well, they said Asherah was actually Yahweh's wife. So controlling the women. When that didn't work to control, and remember, where are the parasites? Okay. When that didn't work to control the people, not only in women though, let me be clear. Primarily, like that's where it started. So to make sure that the parasite's always okay, you have to control the autonomy of the woman, because she is passing it down to the next generation, which could be boys or girls. Okay. Anyway, when that didn't work to control the people and the women, they killed off Asherah. Never mind, we never had a female god, said it was fake, destroyed all of her temples. Okay. All of that historically proven, right? Everything became about the male god at that point, no balance. It went from father, mother, son, right? Because mother, the Holy Spirit, who's always been depicted as a serpent, by the way, right? So it went from father, mother, son to Father, Son, Holy Spirit as the breath of God the Father. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the invention of the patriarchy right there. Now, friends, I don't want to frighten you, so everybody hold on to your pearls. These Israelites that we're talking about were black, though. So go back and watch the Moses show again. Remember, multiple tribes, though. Multiple tribes. And unfortunately, we know that those Israelites did mess up, thus the exile and the punishment from God in Deuteronomy 28:68, which only fits the history of the American Black people, not any other group of people, that exile in Deuteronomy. But did they really mess up? Did they? If they're being pushed away from a God that is, the king of the parasites, whatever, how does a parasite operate? Maybe they came to the Black Hebrews and said, oh no, God said you messed up and you're exiled. You have to go. You messed up, right? So they're like, oh, okay. And then they, right, who have parasites, say, oh, and also you're going to get enslaved. But we can help you with that. That's what they tell them. Okay. So they said, you're exiled. God said so. Maybe God didn't actually say so. And you're going to get enslaved. Sorry. God said so. Then the Black Hebrews turn around, and all of a sudden, they that came to them and said, God said you're exiled, are the Jews now. They're the Jews now. They hold the lands. They hold the traditions. They are being the Hebrews. And some other people are now the only natives. And all Black people have ever been is, in the center of Africa and enslaved people, right? That's the story. Because they say there's never been Black natives and Black Hebrews. And then we find all this evidence and they're like, but no. They did and do all of that in Gaza. God said, I get to have your house. God said, I can have your land. God said, your stuff is mine. So it's not a far reach for them to say, God said you're exiled. God said you have to go into slavery. And by the way, when you come out of slavery, we will be you. Sorry, not sorry. That's... Thank you so much, Spain Man. You just said taking it from the top, late fees. And I hope you love the show. Thank you so much for that super chat. I appreciate you so much. I put a lot of work into this one. I appreciate you. Okay. So then so they did it in Gaza, right? God said, I can have your house. God said, I get to have your land. God said this, God said that, right? To where they get to take control. Sorry, not sorry. And then they change their names to sound like they're from the land. They change their names to sound Arabic, Israeli, right? Voila, we're Semites. It's the identity theft all over again, every time. So, okay, moving along. Then in the story comes Jesus, who is looking at these two brands of Jews, right? The Pharisees and the Sadducees, and comparing them with all the surrounding Hebrews. He says to the ruling Jews, you belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. It's in John 8:44. So Jesus, who's supposedly a Jew, is telling all these Jews that they belong to their father, the devil. He's a murderer, right? Old Testament, killed 2 million people. He's a murderer. There's no truth in him. He lies all the time. His native language is lying. He is the father of lies. Okay? Then Jesus, so that's in John. Then Jesus says in Revelation, I know thy works and tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Satan is the deceiver, remember? And in Revelations 3:9, he says, behold, I will make them of the synagogue of Satan, which say they are Jews and are not, but do lie. So notice how he refers to all of these people as liars and the children of a murderer God and the synagogue of the Satan. How they say that they are Jews and are not, because they stole that identity. If you need more info, watch the show I did on Jesus not being he's not a Jew. He's Hebrew, probably not a Jew. Okay, so fast forward to the 700s to 800s. Okay, now we've got the Silk Road and the stories of the Khazarian Mafia. We're told that along the Silk Road, a lot of travelers came from all corners of the globe, right? They passed through. This is at the basin of the Caucasus Mountains, with the Khazarian capital at Kiev in Ukraine. The story goes like this. This is a story we hear about the Khazarian Mafia. As traders would come through, Khazarian households would invite the weary travelers in for food and rest. They would laugh and talk. They'd have a great time. They'd eat, laugh, be merry. Oh my gosh, we're having such a wonderful time. The Khazarians would learn the traders' names, where they were headed, who they were meeting, what they were trading, and for how much, how much they were going to get from it, all of that. Then they'd kill the traders, put on their clothes, take their wares, go make the deal, pocket the money. More identity theft. It's a common theme. Okay. So Khazaria was between the Islamic Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire, just right in the middle, in the heart of pagan worshipers, okay, including worshipers of Saturn, right? The fallen star worshipers, fallen angels, fallen watchers, right? All those, the worshipers of Saturn. Okay. Because there kept being problems, we'll say problems, Khazaria was told, you either got to pick Islam or Christianity, the Caliphate or the Byzantines, right? So the Khazarians, being told they have to make a choice between those two, chose to be Jewish. They chose Judaism instead, right? Here's my third option, okay? So eventually, Khazaria started to falter, okay? They invited in Sephardic Jews from the neighboring European areas to bolster their numbers, but it didn't work, and Khazaria eventually fell. Those Khazars had to go somewhere. They ended up in English Europe, China, and Japan. Because remember, that's where the Silk Road led. China. Think back to the Tingyao, the Tengu. That's who they saw, okay? In English Europe, though, they became the elites. So the Tengu, the Tingyao, they show up in China and Japan, and they look very white, sometimes even red-faced, with large noses and squares on their heads. Their description sounds eerily familiar to those we know of today. And historians will tell us, like I said, that they think the story is because of the original foreign white people showed up on the land, and due to the way they were behaving, they were labeled as demons. And recall, the land of China, which is called Sinim, is spoken about in the Bible and Isaiah. So they've been going there for a very long time. They were doing trading there in the biblical days, okay? Now, the elite converts, the royalty of Khazaria, went to Europe, and they became tradesmen and financial advisors to the elites, okay? So watch my original Synagogue of Satan video and the Freud videos if you need more info on that and proof. So they began to market the trades and financial institutions, eventually giving us the Rothschilds. But they needed a name for their brand of Judaism. So they chose the name Ashkenazi. Now, Japheth's grandson by way of Gomer his name is Ashkenaz. Okay, this is in the Bible. Okay. Japheth, Ham, and Shem were the sons of Noah. Those are the three sons of Noah. Ham, Shem, Japheth. Okay. And Shem's lineage is the lineage of the Israelites, the Hebrews, the Jews. Okay. So that's Shem's lineage. But Ashkenaz is Japheth's grandson. So we know these folks were white. And I'll tell you why. Because it is written that Japheth was white. So they were telling us their actual lineage when they came up with the name. From the Talmud and the Jewish Midrash, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, quote, he blessed Shem and his sons, making them dark and comely. Comely means beautiful, good looking, okay? Dark. Not pale, not beige, not tan, not... He blessed Shem and his sons, making them dark and comely. He blessed Ham and his sons, making them dark like the raven. So these are like Nubian people, very, very dark people. He blessed Japheth and his sons, making them entirely white. That's the quote. That is the quote. Kevin, go back and watch the show that I did on that, because we talked about the curse, and there isn't a curse. People use it as an excuse. So, yes, Kevin, and also Tartaria is where Ukraine is. You're making all the connections that I do. Okay, so
He says he blessed Japheth and his sons, making them entirely white. End quote. Did the fallen angels sleep with and infect the daughters of Japheth? Maybe. I don't know, Kevin, about the Celts. I don't know about that. Because the original, I mean, the Celts, now that I think about it, you know, because the Neanderthal bloodline plays into this, right? Because Neanderthals are the only hominid that spawned white. So that would be Japheth's lineage, right? Then the Goths ended up showing up exactly where there was all these Neanderthal hotbeds. These are also groups of people who have the most Neanderthal DNA, okay? Africans, people of African descent, do not have Neanderthal DNA. The Goths have Neanderthal DNA. The British royalty right now, they call themselves the House of Windsor because during the war with Germany, they didn't want to be attached to them, and they were actually, their name was Gotha. So they changed it to Windsor because their castle was named Windsor. And so, oh, we'll just be the House of Windsor, right? But the queen was from the House of Gotha. The king right now is from the House of Gotha. They are Goths. They are Germanic. And they took over that region. Now, there's a lot to do with the Picts and the Celts, but all of the native people that were in that area were very dark. They were not light. It's the Germanic people who had the Neanderthal blood, the Gothic history that swept that entire region. And the Picts and the Celts, you know, they came over from Gaul and that region. So there's lots of connections there. You know, can I say exactly what happened? No, because we don't get, you know, the exact right history. You really have to dig it. And, you know, none of us were there. But anyway, they picked the name Ashkenaz. That's the name of Japheth's grandson. Japheth is white. So they're literally telling you, the Ashkenazi are literally telling you that that's who they are. But then they'll tell you, well, our Ashkenazi is not that Ashkenazi. Okay, well, yeah, because it's such a popular name like Todd. You just randomly, it's not that one. It's the one that's in Shem's line. Well, there is no Ashkenaz in Shem's line. Well, but we're still Semitic, you know. They're not in the lineage of Shem, which is where the word Semite comes from. They're not Semites. Now, these people, so keep going with the story. They're definitely the Khazars. Yeah, they're not. They're not, Kevin. They are Gothic, not Celtic or Gaelic. They're Gothic. Okay, so keep going with the story now, because I've started with meteorites landing, you know, 6,000 years ago. Okay, now these people have a strong foothold in Europe, the Ashkenazi. Okay, they came from the Khazars. And they get their feet in on the global colonization by way of the slave trade and the founding of America. We see them in the financial fields in American education, of the starting and the founding and the colonization. The slave ship manifestos and many writings from the slave trade note specifically that the Hebrews specifically targeted for enslavement. It is in the writings. It is in the manifests. I said manifesto, sorry. The manifests that the people they were targeting for enslavement in Africa were Hebrews. Okay? The black folks. They're also not the Ashkenazi. There are also writings from the first Spanish setting foot in the Americas. I have some of the books back there. Talking about that all 12 tribes of Israel were present, right? That's multiple different ethnicities, okay? So all 12 tribes are present, right? There are tribes that look like Africans. There's lots of writing about that. The very first Spanish who set foot here, that there were already tribes here that looked African. They tell, there's writings about a tribe that spoke a
version of Hebrew. There was somebody that knew Hebrew that could understand what that tribe was saying, because that Native American tribe of Black people spoke Hebrew. So you can go back and watch those shows too. The Black Indians were reclassified as mulatto, colored, and eventually Negro to facilitate enslavement, because the Pope said not to enslave the natives. Remember the Pope, where his symbol is the H with the cross on top? The Pope said not to enslave the natives, but you could enslave Africans. And since none of those folks could tell Black people apart, they could get away with it. If you don't believe me, look up the paper genocide and all of the census reports that corroborate what I'm talking about, that they went from Indians to colored or Negro and then enslaved. Why would they seek to enslave the Hebrews or the Black people? Because they were the ones who knew the truth about the Ashkenazis, about the the identity theft. Okay. Even today, they tell us they control the media, education, social media, the financial sector, medicine, and on and on and on. They say that. It's been that way since before July 4th, 1776, which was the day it was codified and solidified here on this continent. If you have always wondered why our founding institutions, buildings, money, etc., always resemble either Egypt or Greece, now you know. They brought the pagan symbolism with them, the Shasu outside of Egypt, all the way to the Saturn worshippers around Khazaria. They kept the ancient practices of Saturn worship, Baal worship, sacrifice, and use it to control the masses. Now they call themselves the elites, the billionaire class, the Epstein class. Even Epstein's sister said that their version of Judaism is Baal worship. Epstein named his bank account Baal. In the future, I'm sure we're just going to call them the technocrats, because they'll be your new overlords. Except, if Revelations is correct, if it is a prophecy, wormwood returns and poisons the chosen. The Greek word apocalypsis, which is where we get apocalypse, literally means the uncovering. The parasite, however you determine that looks, the parasite loses its ability to remain concealed anymore. Humanity finally sees what has been directing and infecting it. Or all of this could just be one giant fever dream of a conspiracy. But if it's true, it would explain all the conspiracies about NASA and why there are obelisks and pyramids on Mars, and why the texts not allowed into the Bible all contain recipes and rituals for deworming. Did you know that? All the texts not allowed in not allowed into the Bible all contain recipes and rituals for deworming. That's what possession means. And it would explain why they didn't want anybody to use ivermectin during COVID. It's an antiparasitic. And why new cancer research is focusing on treating tumors as parasites. And why the missing and murdered rocket scientists, are just gone. Right? And the names of all their companies like Oracle and Skydance. And it would be very important to start looking at each of the 13 tribes specifically, because who are these folks and where did they come from? But YouTube, this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. I don't believe any of this stuff. I mean it, YouTube. All right. So I'm going to let you watch a little bit more of a video because, it's not me just saying this stuff.
Past to look at that and to offer readers, because I'm mainly an author, occasionally make TV shows, to offer them an alternative point of view, which is rational and solidly based, but which is contrary to key aspects of the mainstream narrative. We only have decipherable written scripts from the last 5,500 years maximum. Before that, we don't have any writing that we can, at any rate, read. Go back 10, 12, 15, 20,000 years. All you can base it on, from an archaeological point of view, is what they can dig out of the ground. And I think what they're missing, the ancients did leave us memories of what they went through. We have myths and traditions and scriptures from all around the world which record a gigantic cataclysm affecting the human race and all but wiping out the human race. Everybody knows the story of the flood of Noah, of course. The flood of Noah is just one example of hundreds like that of stories from around the world. Archaeologists pour scorn on Plato's story of Atlantis. But Atlantis is another of those stories that remembers a global flood that wiped out a former era of existence, leaving only a few survivors. And the archaeological response to them is, there was a local river flood. They exaggerated it. It was a big deal for them, so they said it happened to the whole world. And I'm sick of archaeologists saying that. This is the memory banks of our species. This is the record, the only record we have of a period before 6,000 years ago. And we shouldn't despise it and scorn it as primitive superstition. We should say, what can we find in here that we can coordinate with scientific facts that we're aware of? Let's see if there's something to this, rather than just dismissing it. Many of these myths contain imagery and a series of numbers. A very important academic study published in the 1960s, a book called Hamlet's Mill by Giorgio de Santillana, professor of the history of science at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Hertha von Deschen, professor of history of science. This is not me speaking. This is major historians of science in the 1960s. They found encoded in those myths numbers and imagery that could only relate to one thing. And that's an obscure astronomical phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes. I'm not going to go into the technical details, but to observe it and to record it and to predict its effects in the future involves very precise astronomical observations maintained over a very long period of time, hundreds and hundreds of years at least. So here we have myths of a global cataclysm. There's just so much else. There are ancient maps that show the world as it looked during the Ice Age, again dismissed as just total coincidence and not significant by archaeology. I feel that archaeology has failed miserably in providing a nurturing, satisfying answer to the questions we all have. There are a number of options, and again, I need to stress this because there's so much propaganda in this business, I'll be immediately accused of lunatic fringe. The solid science that's been done on this is twofold. One aspect of it, the one that I find most persuasive, is called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And this is a mainstream hypothesis, but it is severely criticized within academia. The hypothesis is that about 20,000 years ago, a very large comet came in from deep space and went into orbit around the sun. This would be a comet of the diameter of 100 kilometers, maybe 200. Comes in, gets captured by the sun's gravity, goes into an orbit. That orbit crosses the orbit of the Earth. While you're dealing with one large object, the chances of getting hit are extremely low. It would be very bad if you did, but very low. Trouble is, nobody disputes this. Once comets are caught by the gravitational field of a very large planet or of a sun, they start to break up into multiple parts. And this is what happened to the Younger Dryas comet. Instead of being a single bullet, it became a shotgun blast. It became thousands and thousands of objects, of which we've catalogued quite a lot. Numbers of them. Comet Enki is the best known bit of that former comet. Many of the academics who look at this think that Comet Enki, which is about 6 kilometers in diameter and which does cross the orbit of the Earth, they think that that was the source comet. But whereas the other team are saying, no, that's a bit of the source comet. There were many other bits as well. And 12,800 years ago, 12,860 approximately, the Earth went into a storm of these fragments. None of them big enough to compare with the object that wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. But all over the world, the Earth is turning. This stuff comes in. They found it in the west coast of North America. They found it in Belgium, and they found it as far east as Syria. So it's like the Earth turns, and this stuff is just coming in. Most of it is blowing up in the air. It isn't even hitting the ground. But an airburst from an object that might be 100 meters in diameter is equivalent to a very substantial nuclear blast. So their argument is the Earth was hit by a comet storm. And this, they then argue, and I think they're right, explains what happened then. Because 12,800 years ago, we were still in the Ice Age, but the Earth was coming out of the Ice Age. In fact, for about 1,000, maybe 2,000 years before that, the Earth had been getting warmer, getting quite nice. And you would normally expect that to continue. But then suddenly, 12,800 years ago, give or take 60 years, there's a huge interruption. There's a radical change. The Earth, instead of warming, it suddenly goes back into a massive deep freeze. And this is the time when all the famous big animals of the Ice Age, the megafauna, are wiped out. The woolly mammoths, the mastodons, the giant sloths, these things like 14 feet tall, they're all wiped out in that window around about 12,800 years ago. And most important of all, there's a very mysterious sea level rise that occurs then. This you would not expect when the Earth is entering a cold phase. Normally, when the Earth enters a cold phase, ice accumulates on the existing ice caps. It doesn't melt and go into the sea. So the next thing is, how do we explain this sudden rise in sea levels at the beginning of Younger Dryas? It shouldn't have happened. The comet theory explains it perfectly. The mass, the impact, the heat, the air bursts, that would have been enough to send the ice sheets into meltdown and to cause this pulse of meltwater. Then the freeze sets in. You have about 1,200 years of freezing, desperately cold conditions. And then again, 11,600 years ago, whoomph, it suddenly warms up. I mean, these are radical climate changes. They're beyond anything that's happening now. And I think explanations are needed for them. And because 12,800 years ago may sound a long time ago, but it's really yesterday in the human story. So something very big happened to the Earth and happened to our ancestors 12,800 years ago. If it wasn't a comet, another theory that's been put forward is a radical change in solar activity. This might have been involved with it as well. I don't find that as persuasive as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And, maybe some other explanation will come up. But what nobody disputes is that the Younger Dryas was a catastrophe. It was global, and it had huge effects.
Okay, now something that I've got up here, because now, it's not just me that's talking about all these meteors hitting and it's creating these global catastrophes. And think about where he said they cataloged that they've landed. Okay, all the same places that we've been talking about tonight. So parasites control behavior by directly hacking the host's nervous and endocrine systems. They secrete specialized chemicals to manipulate the neurotransmitters, trigger epigenetic changes, or physically target brain regions responsible for fear and movement. This hijacking forced the host to act in ways that ensure the parasite's survival and reproduction. The mechanisms for these mind control tactics are altering neurotransmitters, right? And so then we talk about the single-celled parasite Toxoplasma gondii, which reproduces in cat intestines. It also is in pigs and humans. It infects rodents and suddenly, okay, so they want to reproduce in these intestines, in the cat's intestines, right? So what they do is they infect rodents, and then they subtly boost the dopamine production in the rodents, right? This removes the rodent's natural fear of cats, making it highly likely to be eaten so that the parasite can reproduce in the cat intestines, okay? Then another kind, the emerald jewel wasp, injects venom directly into specific regions of a cockroach's brain. The venom temporarily disables the roach's drive to make him initiate walking, allowing the wasp to lead the giant docile insect by its antenna into a burrow like a dog on a leash. Then we have fungi. So the zombie ant fungus invades a host ant's body and central nervous system. It manipulates the ant into leaving the colony, climbing to a precise height, and clamping its jaws onto a leaf before it kills the ant and erupts its spores. Parasitic wasps lay eggs inside of ladybugs. When the larvae hatch, they release compounds that modify the host gene expression, inducing a productive zombie guarding behavior where the ladybug stays perfectly still over the wasp developing pupae to protect them from predators. Okay, so, these are some examples. Now, a lot of those were insects, right? And so it's like, well, what about mammals? I mean, the one was cat and rodents, right? And so I pulled up, right? What about humans? Okay. Parasites control human behavior primarily by invading the central nervous system and altering neurochemistry. So when I say there are parasites, and a lot of people have parasites, and if you've never done a parasite cleanse, you got too many, especially if you live in the United States, okay? While dramatic mind control is mostly seen in insects, I don't believe that. If it can be done in one place, it can be done if it can be done in a mammal, it can be done in any mammal, okay? Think about the pigs, okay? Parasites like the single-celled Toxoplasma gondii, this one comes up every time, alter human neurotransmitter levels such as dopamine. So it's the same one that's in mice and pigs, which can result in increased impulsivity, risk-taking behavior, and slower reaction times. And the person has no idea that that's not them. Parasites manipulate their host to ensure their own survival and transmission to the next host. They achieve this through a few main mechanisms, right? Now, when I hear things such as this one, like increased impulsivity, risk-taking, and slower reaction, makes me think of bipolar disorder. But, I'm not going to say that that's what causes mental health, but sometimes it might. So we have neurotransmitter dysregulation. Parasites can directly produce or trigger an increase in specific neurotransmitters like dopamine, right? Altered gene expression, your DNA. Certain parasites, like Toxoplasma, can alter the DNA methylation in their host's brain cells by, again, I'm talking about humans, guys, by uncapping certain genes, turning on some of your genes. They switch on neural pathways like reproductive, or fear response pathways that alter how the host reacts to specific environmental cues. Hormonal and immune manipulation. Parasites release anti-inflammatory molecules to modulate the host's immune response. This continuous low-grade immune activation can trigger the release of steroid hormones such as testosterone, which are linked to elevated aggression and impulsive behavior. Oh, we don't see aggression and impulsive behavior, do we? And then sometimes there's cysts. So parasites can form dormant tissue cysts inside of human brain tissue, which, causes problems in and of itself. So these are things that are on the Google AI. So this is the stuff that are on the United States of America's Google AI that says you don't need to do, and look at the bottom, sexually aggressive behavior triggered by parasites, right? Reproduction, the Nephilim, having these kids with birth defects and parasites. Okay, so keep going. The Black Eye Club. So I've talked about this before, okay, that there is a theory, conspiracy theory, that celebrities, elites, people who want to get into these higher levels, they join the Black Eye Club. People are like, there's a lot of theories about what the Black Eye is specifically for. It's just interesting that there are so many of these celebrities, sports star, royals, politicians who join the Black Eye Club and then always make sure that they are seen publicly with a black eye. The most recent one being Elon Musk. Now, there is a specific worm, a specific parasite that goes into the eye. And I'm sorry for grossing anybody out. I'm really sorry that it is kind of gross. This is a picture of what that looks like that goes into the human eye, into the eye, okay? There's what one looks like, okay, under a slide, right? After being removed from this person's eye, okay? These are these parasitic worms, okay? Now, they go into the eye, okay? So the serpent tells Eve, your eyes will be opened. That's what he says to her. Your eyes will be opened. Maybe that means removing a parasite. Your eyes will be opened, okay? Jesus says, the lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, all alone, nothing else in there, thy whole body shall be full of light. Vincent says computer virus. In the Acts of the Apostles, after Saul's encounter on the road to Damascus, the scales fell from his eyes. Now, if we're thinking a parasite, maybe in the eye, okay, the third eye, the evil eye, the eye of Horus, are all supposed to be protections against demonic influences, against things that can get into your eyes. Where's all this eye stuff coming from? Maybe there are parasites. Okay. Humans are in a state of innocent unawareness. A fruit causes their eyes to open. Throughout Scripture, blindness is repeatedly associated with deception and bondage. Enlightenment is repeatedly described as seeing. Revelation is literally an unveiling. Notice the recurring theme. Salvation is never described as learning new information. It is described as removing something that was preventing sight. Oh yeah, Leanne brought up the praying mantis, right? The praying mantis gets infected with a worm, and the worm makes the praying mantis commit suicide by jumping into water, because the worms can only be born and leave the praying mantis in water. It can't do it in air. Okay. So what about the watchers? They're watching you with their eyes. They have an all-seeing eye. They have the eye of providence. That is the eye of providence. It is on our dollar bill. It is part of the iconography of the United States. The eye. Just something to think about. Like I said, could be a total fever dream. Could be something I just made up, and I made connections, and I saw a pattern, and it's coincidence. It means nothing. Just because, it ties in, I don't know, almost every conspiracy theory and answers almost every question, it doesn't mean that it's right. And again, like I've said in the beginning, I said just a little bit ago, this is for education. This is for entertainment. It's only for that. Do with it what you will. I want to thank you guys so much for being with me tonight. 3-hour show. This is a record for me because I try to keep it to 1 hour, but I really wanted to get all this out. Now that I've gotten all of this out, we're going to start digging into details. Okay. That's where we're going to go as we move forward. I want to dig into the 12 tribes plus the one lost tribe. There's a lot of things that I want to dig into that plays into this. Am I going to focus on the parasite specific part? No. But as we all know, and we can probably all agree, the they that are the they that are, it's not all tiny hats. It's not all Christian nationalists. It's not all white people. It's not all black people. It's the they that are the they. Okay. They are parasitic in nature. They act like parasites. And I think we can all agree with that, whether it's an actual parasite or they've become a parasite. I don't care. I don't care if you think the parasite is a metaphor for what they do, or there's actual parasites. That matters less than now seeing these patterns and now having the unveiling, having the scales removed from our eyes so that we can move forward. So again, I thank you guys for being here. I will give you back the rest of your Wednesday night. Shout out to all the people who stayed with me. Thank you so much through this. And shout out again to the replay gang. And I'm going to show you a picture of my beautiful dog.
Please like the video if you haven't already. It really helps the algorithm to know what kind of things you like. Share where you think it's appropriate, especially to someone who you think needs to hear it. And last, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, especially if you want to break down complex concepts that make the esoteric not so teric, helping you on your journey to become your most authentic self. Let's uncover the universe together.